Welcome. You have made it to the end of the day, and that matters. This is Bible Stories for Sleep, and tonight we are walking through the parable of the sower together. Scripture reminds us that the Lord gives rest to the weary, and that is exactly what this hour is for. If these stories are a comfort to you, tap subscribe so the next one is always close. Now slow your breathing, soften your shoulders, and let the story carry you. The morning mist hovered like a silver veil above the surface of the Sea of Galilee, undisturbed save for the occasional ripple left by a dipping swallow or the slow, rhythmic heave of a wooden skiff resting against the shore. Dawn arrived not with a sudden blaze of light, but as a gradual awakening of color, bleeding through the lavender shadows of the eastern hills until the water itself began to turn the shade of molten copper. A cool breeze swept down from the heights of the Golan, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of damp reeds, wet earth, and the faint, salty tang of fresh water far from the distant Mediterranean. Along the shorelines, the sleepy hum of crickets faded into the warm hum of a new day, and the world stirred with a quiet, expectant reverence. On the pebbled banks near Capernaum, the small community of disciples and early risers gathered in the hush of the morning. Simon Peter stood near the water's edge, his thick, calloused hands wiping the moisture from the gunwale of his boat. His shoulders were heavy with the familiar ache of a long night spent casting nets into dark waters that had yielded far too little. Yet, beneath his fatigue, there was a restless curiosity, an electric tension that always accompanied the presence of the rabbi from Nazareth. Peter squinted against the rising glare, his gaze fixed on Jesus, who stood a short distance away, looking out across the vast, shining expanse of the lake. Jesus of Nazareth possessed the quiet stillness of an ancient olive tree rooted deep in the rocky soil of the hills. His skin was bronzed and weathered by years under the Galilean sun, his hands scarred from the honest labor of a carpenter, and his dark eyes held a depth that seemed to encompass both the sorrow and the beauty of the world. He wore a simple, dust-flecked tunic of undyed wool, and as he breathed in the crisp morning air, his chest rose and fell with a steady, unhurried rhythm. He was weary, carrying the invisible weight of the multitudes who pressed upon him day after day, yet his spirit remained anchored in a profound, unshakable peace. Further up the slope, where the rocky path gave way to terraced fields of wheat and barley, Jonathan the tenant farmer leaned heavily against a low stone wall. Jonathan's hands were stained with the dark loam of the valley, his fingernails permanently rimmed with earth, and his skin was lined by decades of wrestling a living from an unforgiving terrain. He knew every inch of this ground, the deceitful patches where a thin layer of dust hid a slab of impenetrable limestone, the thorny briars of wild mustard that choked out the tender shoots overnight, and the hard-packed trodden paths where the village traffic beat the earth into stone. Jonathan was a skeptic by trade, shaped by years of blighted crops, late rains, and the bitter disappointment of a harvest lost to the wind. He crossed his arms over his chest, watching the gathering crowd with a guarded, critical eye, wondering what a teacher from the carpenter's bench could possibly tell a man who knew the heartbreak of the furrow. Not far from Jonathan, standing quietly among the gathering multitude, Miriam of Magdala listened to the distant murmur of the waves. Her gaze was fixed entirely upon Jesus. Miriam possessed a rare, luminous stillness, a quiet intensity born of a life that had known profound fracture and subsequent, miraculous healing. She absorbed the scene around her with a discerning eye, noticing the way the golden light caught the edge of the fishing nets, the way the wild lilies swayed gently on the hillside, and the subtle shift in Jesus's posture as he turned back toward the shore. She sensed that the day would not merely bring more words, but a revelation, a key to understanding the hidden mechanics of the human heart, and why some souls received grace like a deep, well-watered field, while others let it slip away like dust between their fingers. The crowd began to swell, spilling down the winding paths from the surrounding hills. Mothers with sleeping infants wrapped in linen cloths, shepherds leaning on their crooked staves, merchants from the trade routes, and children chasing one another through the tall grass all gravitated toward the water's edge. The collective murmur of voices rose like the sound of wind through an orchard, pressing closer and closer until there was scarcely room to stand between the water and the base of the rocky bluff. Jesus turned, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, faces lined with anxiety, worn by poverty, illuminated by hope, or hardened by skepticism. He saw the invisible burdens every person carried, the quiet desperation for a kingdom that transcended the harsh political realities of Roman occupation and religious fatigue. He needed space. He needed the natural architecture of the landscape to amplify the quiet resonance of his voice so that every ear, from the front row to the very fringes of the gathering, might catch the whisper of eternal truths. Stepping forward, Jesus caught Simon Peter's eye and offered a brief, reassuring nod. Peter blinked, then hastily grabbed the wooden bowline, steadying the hull as Jesus stepped lightly into the boat. The weathered timber creaked softly beneath his sandals. With a gentle push from Peter's sturdy arms, the skiff glided a few yards out from the shoreline, riding the calm, buoyant swells of the shallow water. The lake served as a magnificent natural amphitheater. The smooth surface of the water reflected the brilliant morning sky, acting as a mirror of light, while the stillness of the cove carried sound with startling clarity. When Jesus sat down in the stern of the boat, resting his arm upon the gunwale, the gentle lapping of the ripples against the wooden planks provided a soothing, rhythmic bassline to the morning. From the shore, Jonathan the tenant farmer adjusted his footing on the dusty path, leaning forward to listen. Miriam folded her hands over her shawl, her breath catching softly in the cool air as she waited. Peter stood knee-deep in the shallows beside the boat, holding the mooring line with one hand while water cascaded in shimmering droplets from his bare ankles. The multitude fell into a profound, breathless silence. The rustle of garments ceased. Even the distant cry of a hawk wheeling high above the limestone cliff seemed to recede into the vast expanse of the sky. Jesus looked out across the water, then back toward the terraced hillsides where farmers were already beginning their morning toil. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last remnants of the silver mist and washing the landscape in a warm, amber glow. The air grew still and sweet, heavy with the scent of crushed sage and sun-warmed earth. In that perfect pause between the night's rest and the day's labor, the teacher opened his mouth, and his voice, clear, resonant, and carrying effortlessly across the calm water, began to weave a tapestry of familiar sights, hidden mysteries, and the quiet, miraculous unfolding of the kingdom of heaven. The voice of the teacher did not demand attention, rather, it rose gently from the shore like the morning mist itself, drawing the scattered multitude inward toward a shared stillness. He stood upon the prow of a small wooden fishing boat, its hull rocking almost imperceptibly against the gentle swell of the Sea of Galilee, while the crowd lined the natural amphitheater of the sloping shore. Fishermen mending their nets paused with knotted twine half pulled between their fingers, and women carrying earthen jars of water set them quietly upon the clover-dotted grass. Among them walked the wayfarer, a merchant from the inland districts whose tunic was heavy with the dust of distant trade routes. His mind was a turbulent marketplace of ledgers, debts, and the fluctuating price of grain in the markets of Tiberias. He had paused only because the crowd blocked his path toward the southern gate, his brow furrowed with impatience, his fingers absently tracing the heavy leather coin purse tied securely at his belt. He wanted nothing more than to bypass the gathering, to reach the market before the morning heat settled into the valleys, yet the resonance of the teacher's voice seemed to anchor his boots to the dusty earth. "Listen," the teacher said, his gaze sweeping slowly across the sea of upturned faces, lingering for a brief, compassionate moment on the restless merchant standing at the outer fringe. A sower went out to sow. As he scattered the seed, some fell along the path, where the ground had been beaten flat by the tread of countless travelers and the hooves of pack animals over long, dry summers. The description conjured an immediate, vivid image in the minds of all who listened, painting the familiar landscape of rural Galilee with startling clarity. The sower was a familiar figure to every person in the valley, a man clad in rough linen, walking with a steady, rhythmic stride across the undulating contours of the hillside. With every step, his calloused hand dipped deep into the woven leather pouch hanging at his side, withdrew a generous handful of golden grain, and flung it outward in a wide, sweeping arc. The seeds flew like a golden mist against the pale blue sky, scattering indiscriminately across the varied terrain of the hillside farm. Not all the earth received the gift with equal grace. Along the eastern edge of the plowed field ran the ancient footpath, a narrow scar of grey earth worn smooth and impenetrable by the daily passage of shepherds, merchants, and Roman couriers. Generations of footfall had compacted the soil until it possessed the density of sun-baked brick, utterly impervious to the gentle persuasion of rain or iron plow. When the sower's hand flung the grain across the boundary of the field, several heavy, plump seeds struck this hardened ribbon with a sharp, dry rattle, resting upon the surface like scattered coins dropped upon a stone floor. The merchant, standing at the edge of the crowd, looked down at his own sandals, caked with the dust of the very same paths the teacher described. A sudden, quiet resonance stirred within him, though he brushed it aside almost instantly as his thoughts drifted back to a delayed shipment of Persian wool waiting at the docks. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze wandering over the sunlit slope where the drama of the sower continued to unfold in the rhythmic cadence of the rabbi's voice. Upon that hardened path, the seeds found no sanctuary. They lay exposed to the brilliant, climbing sun and the restless wind that swept down from the Golan Heights. But the sun and wind were not the only presences waiting in the quiet margins of the morning. High above the terraced hills, a shadow flickered against the azure sky. A flock of wild doves and dark-winged crows, sensing the scattering of grain from the safety of the olive branches, descended in a swift, silent rush. Their wings beat the air with a soft, rushing sound, a sudden flurry of motion that broke the contemplative hush of the hillside. With sharp, eager movements, the birds landed upon the dusty footpath, their bright, bead-like eyes scanning the ground with mechanical precision. In a matter of heartbeat moments, long before the merchant could draw a full breath or the crowd could murmur at the sudden descent, the seeds were gone. The birds scooped them up with quick, snapping motions of their beaks, leaving the path as bare and empty as it had been before the sower ever set foot upon the slope. Not a single trace of the golden grain remained upon the beaten track, swallowed up entirely by the swift, insatiable appetite of the wild things of the air. The teacher paused, letting the silence settle over the hillside like falling dew. The lapping of the water against the wooden hull of the boat filled the quiet interval, a rhythmic, soothing counterpoint to the profound stillness that gripped the multitude. In the heart of the wayfarer, a strange sensation flickered and died. For one fleeting instant, as the birds descended upon the path in his mind's eye, he had felt the unsettling vulnerability of his own thoughts, how easily the constant clamor of his trade, the anxieties of profit and loss, swooped down to snatch away any quiet reflection before it could take root in his soul. But the feeling was fragile. Before he could grasp its meaning, a passing donkey brayed in a nearby lane, and the spell of introspection frayed. He adjusted his tunic, cleared his throat softly, and prepared to slip away from the gathering, his mind already racing ahead to the bustling stalls of the lower city, leaving the hard-packed path and the stolen seed behind in the morning sun. The morning sun continued its slow, inexorable climb above the eastern ridge, casting a sharp, golden light across the terraced hillsides that sloped gently down toward the shimmering expanse of the Sea of Galilee. The crisp, damp scent of the early mist was rapidly burning away, replaced by the dry, powdery aroma of sun-baked dust and baking earth. Along the winding footpaths, the crowd shifted and murmured, the initial stillness of the early hour giving way to the restless energy of the approaching day. Jesus of Nazareth stood upon a slight outcrop of grey limestone, his sandaled feet planted firmly against the uneven stone. His tunic, woven from coarse, undyed wool, caught the rising breeze, and his sun-weathered hands rested easily upon his staff. His eyes, dark and remarkably observant, swept across the gathered multitude, noting every shift in posture, every flicker of doubt, and every sudden spark of fragile enthusiasm. He had seen the hard-packed path claim its portion of the scattered grain, snatched away by the watchful scavengers of the air before it even knew the touch of moisture. Yet his gaze did not linger there. Instead, his eyes drifted slightly higher, toward the narrower ledges of the hillside where the slope grew steeper and the earth thinned away into a pale, dust-colored veneer. Among the listeners standing near those upper ledges was old Eli. Eli was a man whose shoulders bore the distinct curve of decades spent coaxing life from stubborn, unyielding ground. His face was a map of deep creases, carved by years of wind, sun, and quiet disappointments. Life had not been gentle to Eli. In his youth, he had poured his hopes into various ventures, investing his labor in communal olive presses that later failed, trusting partners who proved untrustworthy, and watching two of his own children take distant paths across the salt sea trade routes never to return. Those successive griefs had not broken him outright, but they had taught him a cautious, defensive wisdom. He had learned, through bitter experience, that to love deeply or to hope without reservation was to invite an inevitable sorrow. His heart had gradually built a thick, impenetrable armor, layer upon layer of emotional scar tissue designed to keep the bruising world at bay. As Jesus began to speak once more, his voice carrying effortlessly across the uneven terrain like the low, resonant hum of a bronze bell, Eli found himself stepping forward. "Listen," Jesus said, his tone dropping into a register that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly within the quiet chambers of the heart. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where there was not much soil. and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. Eli blinked, his gaze locking onto the teacher. There was something in the cadence of the Galilean's voice that struck a chord long dormant within the old man's chest. It was a warmth, fierce yet tender, that reminded Eli of the springs of his boyhood before the world grew heavy and complex. He felt a sudden, unaccustomed surge of emotion, a bright, leaping flare of enthusiasm that seemed to bypass all his careful defenses. Around him on the rocky slope, others reacted similarly. Younger men and women, weary of the monotonous daily grind of village life and burdened by the heavy taxes and social anxieties of the occupation, leaned forward with wide, shining eyes. They felt a sudden rush of hope, an intoxicating conviction that perhaps a great change was at hand, that the kingdom of God was not merely a distant theological dream, but a living, breathing reality breaking right through the stony surface of their everyday existence. It sprang up immediately, Jesus repeated, his gaze sweeping over the eager faces on the slope, because the earth had no depth. Eli felt a sympathetic shiver run down his spine. He remembered the sudden, brilliant crops of wild mustard that would appear after a freak winter rain on these very hillsides, how they would burst forth in a sea of vibrant yellow almost overnight, creating an illusion of abundant, flourishing life where nothing had grown before. It was a magnificent sight, brilliant against the dull grey of the stone. Yet Eli knew the secret of those hills. He knew what lay just beneath that thin, deceptive dusting of dark topsoil. Only an inch or two below the surface rested the solid, ancient shelf of native limestone, impenetrable, cold, and entirely devoid of moisture. The seeds that had fallen here had found a welcoming warmth. The sun had coaxed them into a frantic, premature display of vitality. Without the burden of heavy earth to slow their ascent, the shoots had erupted upward with astonishing speed, outpacing everything else on the hillside. Eli felt a swelling of empathy for those shallow places. He recognized himself in that rapid, unprotected growth. Whenever a new idea, a new friendship, or a sudden burst of spiritual fervor had entered his life over the years, he had embraced it with a fierce, blinding intensity. He had wanted so badly to believe that this time, the soil of his heart was deep enough to hold it. He had thrown himself into moments of communal prayer and sudden vows, feeling a lightness in his chest that felt very much like freedom. Yet, as the morning sun continued its relentless ascent into the pale blue vault of the sky, the atmosphere of the hillside began to shift. The crisp, refreshing chill of the dawn breeze died away completely, replaced by the heavy, stagnant stillness of mid-morning. The sun, climbing toward its zenith, began to pour down a blinding, white-hot glare that seemed to strip the landscape of all its gentle shadows. The dust along the footpaths turned fine and chalky, rising in tiny, suffocating plumes whenever a sheep shifted its weight or a listener adjusted his sandals. Up on the narrow ledges, the temperature rose sharply. The thin layer of earth, having no mass to insulate it, absorbed the heat with terrifying efficiency. It grew warm, then hot, and finally scorching to the touch. Jesus watched the transition with a solemn, compassionate gravity. He raised his hand slightly, gesturing toward the rocky terraces where the eager green shoots were now standing fully exposed to the elements. And when the sun rose, Jesus said, his voice steady and unyielding, "It was scorched. And because it had no root, it withered away." The words hung in the quiet air, laden with a stark, undeniable truth. Eli watched as the physical reality of the hillside mirrored the parable before his very eyes. The tiny green plants that had seemed so triumphant just an hour ago were now beginning to flag. Their tender leaves, which had pointed so proudly toward the sky, lost their crisp turgidity. They began to curl inward at the edges, turning a dull, papery gray-green as the moisture within their cells was rapidly drawn out by the voracious heat. There was no reserve of water for them to draw upon. The roots, having encountered the solid, unyielding floor of the limestone bedrock just a fraction of an inch below the surface, had nowhere to go. They could not push downward, they could not tunnel through the ancient stone to reach the deep, subterranean moisture that slumbered far beneath the hill. Instead, the roots had simply curled around themselves in a shallow, tangled mat, trapped in a superficial existence of light and air. Eli felt a familiar, cold knot tightening in his stomach. He knew that sensation of being trapped against an internal stone. He had felt it every time a crisis had visited his household, a sudden illness, a failing harvest, a sharp word from a neighbor that threatened his fragile peace. Whenever the heat of trial had beaten down upon his life, his immediate instinct had not been to reach deeper into faith or patient endurance. His instinct had been to retreat, to curl inward, to protect the vulnerable core of his being from further pain. The enthusiasm that had felt so profound a moment ago now began to feel exposed, fragile, and terribly foolish. Around him on the slope, some of the younger listeners were beginning to shift uneasily. The sheer intensity of the sun was becoming uncomfortable, sweat beaded on their foreheads, and the dust was clinging to their throats. The romantic charm of gathering on a hillside to listen to a wandering rabbi was beginning to collide with the stark, unromantic reality of the morning heat. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Someone muttered about the midday chores waiting back in the village, another complained quietly about the glare reflecting off the limestone rocks into his eyes. Jesus did not stop speaking, nor did he raise his voice to compete with their murmurs. His quiet authority seemed to anchor the space, forcing those who remained to look directly at the sobering lesson unfolding around them. The sun, Jesus explained, his eyes meeting old Eli's gaze for a long, piercing moment, is the tribulation or persecution that arises on account of the word. Immediately, they fall away. There was no judgment in his voice, only an unvarnished description of the human heart under pressure. Jesus understood the mechanics of survival. He knew how easily a soul, unacquainted with the slow, grueling work of cultivating deep roots, would fold when the cost of belief became too high. To stand in the presence of grace during the cool mist of morning was easy, to remain steadfast when the sun beat down with the harsh reality of rejection, misunderstanding, or personal suffering required a different kind of strength entirely, a strength that could only be found in the dark, hidden, unglamorous depths of the earth. Eli felt a sudden desire to look away, to break the hold of those observant eyes. The comparison was too close, too painfully accurate. He remembered the winter of 3 years prior, when rumors had begun to circulate through the villages about a new movement, a man from Nazareth who was speaking of a kingdom not built on political power or military might, but on radical forgiveness and spiritual rebirth. At first, Eli had been captivated. He had attended secret gatherings in the olive groves. He had felt his hardened heart soften, just as it was softening now. He had even spoken to his neighbors about the coming redemption with a bright, sudden fervor. But then the local authorities had begun to murmur. Whispers of heresy and political danger had drifted down from the regional council in Tiberias. Neighbors had begun to look at those who followed the Galilean with suspicion and cold reserve. And Eli had retreated. He had pulled back his presence, quieted his tongue, and returned safely to the predictable, solitary routine of his olive trees. He had convinced himself at the time that he was merely being practical, that caution was the better part of valor. But looking at the scorched, withered shoots on the ledge before him now, Eli saw the truth of his actions with stark clarity. His faith had not been uprooted by force, it had simply died of thirst because it had never penetrated the stone. It had lacked the depth required to endure the rising temperature of social disapproval and personal risk. The sun continued its relentless climb, now standing high and bright over the crest of the hills. The shadows beneath the olive trees shrank into small, dark pools at their trunks. The air shimmered with heat haze, blurring the distant outlines of the village rooftops down in the valley. On the rocky ledges, the process was nearly complete. The plants that had sprung up with such joyful, uncritical speed were now dry husks, their green leaf entirely spent, their fragile stems snapping brittly in the dry breeze. The shallow soil around them had baked into a hard, grey crust that cracked open under the pressure of the heat, revealing once more the pale, unyielding limestone underneath. The crowd on the hillside shifted more noticeably now. The romantic illusion was broken. The harsh light of day had exposed the limitations of the ground, and several listeners near the back quietly turned their backs on the teacher, picking their way down the dusty path toward the cool shelter of their homes. They had wanted the harvest without the plowing, they had wanted the joy without the depth, they had wanted the kingdom without the cross. Jesus watched them go, his expression neither angry nor surprised. He simply adjusted his stance upon the grey stone, his gaze remaining steady upon those who stayed, those few who, despite the heat, despite the stark reality of the rocky ground laid bare before them, remained rooted to the earth, listening with a quiet, somber intensity. Cultivated wild. The plants stood defiant, their grey-green stems armored with long, needle-sharp spikes that gleamed silver in the morning glare. They looked sturdy, almost prosperous, thriving on the very moisture and nutrients intended for the spring wheat. In the quiet sanctuary of his own mind, Jonathan felt a familiar, dull ache of recognition. This was not the sudden, catastrophic failure of the rocky ground where seeds withered under the noon glare without a whimper. This was something far more insidious. This was the slow, creeping theft of life that happened while a man was simply trying to survive. The teacher turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it rested for a long, unhurried moment upon Jonathan's weathered face. There was no accusation in those dark, observant eyes, only a profound, fathomless understanding that pierced straight through the armor of cynicism Jonathan had worn for 40 years against the harshness of the land. The seed sown among the thorns, Jesus continued, his words falling into the dry air with the deliberate weight of stones dropped into a deep well, is the one who hears the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Jonathan swallowed hard, the taste of dust coating the back of his throat. He thought of the endless calculations that consumed his nights long after his wife and children had fallen asleep. He thought of the taxes demanded by herds collectors, the fluctuating price of barley at the Tiberias market, the constant, gnawing fear of drought, mildew, and locusts. These were not wicked things in themselves, they were simply the unyielding facts of existence. A farmer had to worry about the harvest, or there would be no bread. A man had to guard his meager silver, or his family would starve. Yet, as he looked at the tangled briars before him, he saw the tragic truth of the metaphor. The thorns did not arrive overnight as a sudden plague. They began as harmless, unnoticed green shoots sharing the same furrow with the wheat. In the tender weeks of early spring, there was plenty of room for both. The young wheat stalks reached upward with bright, hopeful green leaves, and beside them, the delicate, unassuming leaves of the briar unfurled in quiet harmony. Jonathan remembered planting his best wheat in the lower plot 3 years ago, full of high hopes after a winter of heavy, soaking rains. The germination had been magnificent. Every furrow was lined with a thick, emerald carpet that promised a golden yield. But he had been distracted by a dispute over boundary stones with a neighboring landowner, and then by the sickness of his youngest ox, which threatened to halt his plowing before the autumn sowing. For 2 crucial months, his attention had been entirely absorbed by the immediate crises of survival and litigation. When he finally walked back down to the lower terrace, the wheat was struggling. It was still there, slender and pale, but it was fighting for its life against a dense, impenetrable thicket of thorny scrub. The weeds had stolen the march on him. Their roots, hidden deep beneath the surface in a tangled, fibrous mat, had sucked up the moisture and drained the rich nitrogen from the earth before the delicate roots of the wheat could reach them. The young stalks had grown tall and spindly, stretching desperately upward through the thorny canopy for a last glimpse of the morning sun, but they had no substance. When the harvest came, he swung his sickle through a mass of dry, scratchy stalks, and when he threshed the sheaves on the stone floor, the winnowing wind carried away only chaff and dust. There was no grain. All that labor, all that hope, swallowed up by weeds he had been too busy to pull. The memory settled over him like the heavy, stagnant air of a noon valley. Jonathan shifted his gaze from the ground back to the face of the Nazarene. Jesus was speaking softly now, his hand resting lightly on a low stone wall where wild caper bushes spilled over the edge. "A man cannot serve 2 masters," he seemed to say, though the words were carried away on a sudden gust of wind, replaced by the lingering resonance of his previous thought. The teacher was describing the human heart not as a barren desert, but as a crowded room where every corner was contested space. The morning mist had completely vanished now, burned away by the relentless climb of the sun. The hills shimmered in the dry heat, the olive leaves turning their silvery undersides upward as if pleading for relief. Around them, the crowd shifted restlessly. Some nodded in quiet agreement, their faces lined with the same private burdens Jonathan carried. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the directness of the mirror being held up to their daily anxieties. Jonathan looked down at his hands. The skin across his knuckles was split and dry, mapped with the scars of 1,000 minor cuts from thorns and sharp stones. He had spent his entire life fighting the land, wresting bread from reluctant earth, but he realized with a sudden, sinking clarity that he had allowed the very struggle for leave to crowd out the source of leave itself. The daily worries, what they would eat, what they would wear, how they would protect their meager dignity against the grinding gears of the empire, had grown thick and thorny in his mind, wrapping around his spirit until there was no room left for grace to take root. The silence that followed the parable was heavy, thick with the weight of unexpressed thoughts and the rustle of dry grass in the wind. Jesus did not shout or press for an immediate response. He stood quietly, letting the words settle into the rich, troubled soil of his listeners' hearts, waiting to see what would grow from the seed he had just cast into the open air. The silence that lingered upon the sloping hillside was not an empty quiet, but a living thing, charged with the heavy, sweet scent of crushed time and the damp earth exhaling beneath the morning sun. Jesus stood motionless, his sandaled feet planted firmly in the dust of the path, his gaze sweeping slowly across the vast assembly of faces upturned toward him. There were fishermen with salt-cracked hands, weavers whose eyes held the weary geometry of looms, and children who had grown quiet simply because the grown-ups had stopped moving. Miriam of Magdala stood near the front, her fingers lightly touching the woven strap of her shawl. She could still feel the sharp, bitter memory of the thorny ground echoing in her own chest, how easily the daily anxieties of survival, the constant, low hum of fear and debt, could choke out a fragile, holy thought before it ever learned to breathe. She looked from the rough limestone paths behind them, where the seed had perished before it opened, to the deep, dark furrows stretching out toward the valley floor, where the earth lay rich and waiting. Jesus turned his face toward that lower basin, where the plow of some diligent farmer had cut deep, straight lines through the dark loam. "Here then," Jesus said, and his voice, though not raised above a conversational tone, carried effortlessly across the slope, riding the light thermal wind rising from the lake. "Hear the mystery of what is prepared." He began to walk down the slope, moving away from the hard footpath and the stony ledges, stepping gently into the deep soil of the valley floor. The ground here was soft beneath his feet, yielding and dark, smelling richly of ancient humus and recent rain. The multitude shifted, a collective rustle of garments and shuffling sandals, following his movement as water follows an incline. They moved past the places where the limestone lurked just beneath the surface, past the wild briars tangled in the stone walls, descending until they stood at the edge of the great, ploughed expanse. Miriam walked beside him, her eyes fixed on the rich earth turned up by the heavy iron-tipped plough. Each clod of earth was damp at its core, holding the overnight dew within its dark embrace like a secret kept safe from the scouring wind. "The seed that falls into the good ground," Jesus spoke softly, as much to the wind as to the listening thousands, "this is the one who hears the word, and indeed understands it. He bears fruit, and yields, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He stooped, his fingers brushing against a clod of newly turned earth, crumbling it with a slow, deliberate pressure. The soil broke apart effortlessly, fine and dark, spilling through his weathered fingers like dark water. Around them, across the vast valley floor, the farmers of Galilee knew this ground well. They knew the grueling labor it took to clear such a field, the hours spent hauling away heavy field stones, the endless weeding of thistle roots, the deep, exhausting turns of the wooden plough biting into the stubborn clay until the earth was humbled and rendered tender. It was a partnership between human patience and the generosity of the Creator, a covenant written in sweat and soil. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist from the reeds along the shore of the Galilean Sea, a profound shift occurred in the atmosphere. The crisp chill of dawn gave way to a golden, sustaining warmth that settled over the valley like a blessing. In the quiet focus of the crowd, something unburdened itself. The restless murmuring ceased entirely. People looked at one another, neighbors who had harbored grievances, debtors weighed down by the crushing demands of the tax collectors, women who carried grief in the silence of their hearts, and for a moment, the thorns of their daily existence seemed to loosen their grip. The parable had named their hidden struggles, and in being named, those struggles lost their absolute dominion. Miriam closed her eyes for a brief heartbeat, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, and she understood the depth of the teaching. The soil was not merely a passive thing, it was a heart that had consented to be broken open, a life that had grown weary of shallow living and had chosen the arduous, beautiful path of depth. "Look," Jesus whispered, gesturing toward a single, small green shoot that had already pushed its way through the dark crust of a nearby furrow. It was a miracle so quiet that most would have missed it in the rush of the day. A single spear of vibrant, impossibly green life, standing tall and straight against the vast brown expanse of the earth. It did not struggle with frantic haste, it simply absorbed the light, drawing moisture from the deep reservoirs below, its roots plunging downward into the dark, unseen safety of the soil with absolute trust. The sight sent a ripple of quiet all through the assembly. Here was the promise made visible. The seed that had seemed lost to the dark, swallowed up by the heavy earth, had not perished at all. It had undergone the great, silent transformation of life. It had surrendered its hard shell, letting go of its former self so that a new and greater reality could emerge. Jesus stood beside the tiny shoot, his eyes shining with a quiet, triumphant light. The weariness that had marked his face earlier in the morning seemed to lift, replaced by the profound, steady joy of the sower who sees the first fruits of his labor. "The kingdom of heaven," Jesus said, his voice swelling with a quiet power that resonated in the very bones of everyone present, "is like this. It is planted in the hidden places. It grows while men sleep and while they wake, by night and by day, the seed sprouts and grows upward, though the farmer does not know how. For the earth yields crops automatically, first the blade, then the head, after that the full grain in the head." The metaphor hung in the warm air, magnificent and liberating. The listeners realized that transformation was not a matter of frantic striving or desperate human willpower, but of alignment, of allowing the truth to find deep lodging within the soul, where it could work its silent, steady alchemy. Across the valley, the golden light of the morning caught the edges of the distant hills, turning the olive groves into seas of shimmering silver and green. The wind blew softly, rustling through the newly awakened fields, carrying the rich, fertile scent of leaf multiplying beyond measure. Miriam watched the single green shoot sway gently in the breeze, feeling an answering strength rise up within her own spirit. The fears that had crowded her mind like thorns were fading into the vast, bright landscape, rendered small and powerless before the magnificent scale of this growing life. The ground of her heart felt deep, plowed, and infinitely receptive, watered by a grace she no longer needed to earn, but only to receive. Jesus turned away from the furrow, beginning a slow, deliberate ascent back toward the crest of the hill, his disciples and the multitude following in a reverent, orderly hush. They walked not with the heavy tread of a conquered people, but with the light, assured steps of those who had seen the secret of the harvest and understood that the world had been forever changed. The sun stood high in the azure sky now, flooding the Galilean hills with brilliant, golden light, warming the good earth, and illuminating a future that stretched out endlessly before them, rich with the promise of a hundredfold return. The golden warmth of the midday sun continued to pour over the sloping hills of Galilee, baking the dry earth of the path and drawing a faint, earthy fragrance from the wild grasses that clung to the edges of the terrace. Jesus stood near the crest of the rise, where the gentle slope of the land fell away toward the shimmering expanse of the inland sea. His white woolen tunic, dust-stained at the hem from the morning's walk, stirred softly in the light breeze that drifted off the water. Around him, the multitude of listeners, fishermen with weather-beaten hands, women bearing clay pitchers, children darting quietly between the elders, lingered in the heavy stillness of the afternoon. Simon Peter stood a few paces to the left, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of a thick, calloused arm, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures of the crowd. His mind was still turning over the strange cadence of the parable, turning it round and round like a smooth river stone, searching for the weight of bronze or the sharp edge of a sword, wondering when the kingdom would finally break through the sky with unmistakable power. Yet, as he looked out over the sun-drenched fields, he felt only the steady, rhythmic lapping of the tiny waves far below and the soft rustle of olive leaves in the valley. Jesus looked out over the gathering, his dark, observant eyes taking in every face, from the eager disciples to the curious strangers who had paused by the roadside. He raised his hand slightly, not to command silence, for silence already blanketed the hillside, but to gather the scattered threads of their attention one last time before the assembly dissolved beneath the mounting heat. "Whoever has ears to hear," Jesus said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the dry grass, clear and resonant as a bell hung in an open courtyard, "let them hear." The words lingered in the warm air long after his lips had closed. They did not fall like a hammer striking stone, but rather like a handful of fine seed cast upon an unplowed floor, left for each person to gather or to leave behind. Among the fringe of the crowd stood a wayfarer, a merchant whose pack of dyed woolen threads and small brass trinkets weighed heavily across his sun-scorched shoulders. He had paused only moments before, drawn in by the murmur of the multitude, his mind already racing ahead to the market stalls of Tiberias and the fluctuating price of grain. As Jesus spoke the final phrase, the merchant blinked, his fingers twitching instinctively toward the leather strap of his burden. The agrarian imagery of sowers, rocks, and thorny thickets felt distant, almost foreign, to a man whose life was measured by denarii and ledger marks. With a slight shake of his head, as if clearing away a stray cobweb, he turned his back to the hill and hurried down the dusty footpath, his sandals kicking up tiny puffs of powdery earth that settled back into the ground, leaving no trace of his passing. Around him, others began to move as well. The great assembly fractured into smaller clusters of families and neighbors, their voices rising in a soft, low murmur of speculation and debate as they drifted down the hillside toward the lake shore. A sower throwing seed on a footpath, an older farmer muttered to his companion, shifting a wooden reaping hook from one shoulder to the other as they navigated a steep drop in the trail. Any fool knows the birds will have it before it even settles. Why speak in riddles when the law is plain enough? "It is not about grain, neighbor," replied a younger man, his eyes bright with lingering wonder as he looked back toward the crest of the hill where the teacher still stood. "Did you not hear him speak of the heart? He was talking about how we listen, how we let things in, or how we keep them out. My heart is busy enough keeping bread on the table," the farmer grumbled good-naturedly, though his steps slowed slightly as a cool gust of wind swept up from the water, carrying the sharp, clean scent of damp reeds and salt. "Bread is what grows in the ground, not mysteries." Further down the slope, near the junction where the upper path met the main coastal road, a group of women walked together, balancing water jars upon their shoulders. Their conversation drifted back on the breeze, a gentle cadence of domestic worry and quiet marvel. "He spoke of the thorns," one woman said, adjusting the woven ring beneath her clay vessel. "How the cares of this leave choke out everything else." I felt as though he were sitting in my own kitchen, listening to the worries I carry before the sun even rises. "And the rocky ground," another murmured, her gaze fixed on the pale, sun-bleached outcroppings of limestone that jutted from the hillside like the bones of the earth. "Quick to sprout, but with nowhere to go when the heat comes." We all know what it is to weather a dry season, when the sky turns like brass and the crops wither in a single afternoon. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows beneath the gnarled branches of the ancient olive trees that dotted the lower terraces. The dust raised by the departing feet settled slowly into the ruts of the road, and the loud, urgent hum of the marketplace seemed a world away from the tranquil, sunlit slopes where the Galilean hills rolled gently toward the water. Simon Peter watched the last of the distant travelers disappear around a bend in the shore, their figures shrinking until they blended into the shimmering haze rising from the lake. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension slowly drain from his shoulders as the quiet afternoon wrapped around them like a warm garment. "They listen," Simon said softly, speaking more to himself than to the master, "yet they walk away with their hands just as empty as when they came. They hear the voice, but the world takes it back before it can take root." Jesus turned his gaze toward the west, where the distant peaks of the upper Galilee caught the white glare of the noon sun. He did not answer immediately, allowing the stillness of the landscape to speak its own patient language. The mystery of the kingdom was not a fortress to be stormed, nor a secret to be unlocked by force. It was a seed entrusted to the soil, working its quiet, unseen transformation in the dark. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the terraced hillsides, stretching long and indigo over the dusty furrows where the crowds had lately Saturday. One by one, the multitudes had gathered their belongings, hoisted their wicker baskets, and begun the winding descent toward the scattered villages along the shore of the Galilean Sea. The murmur of 1,000 departing voices faded into the hum of evening cicadas, leaving behind the dry, sweet scent of crushed thyme and sun-baked earth. High upon the slope, sheltered within the ancient embrace of an olive grove, the gnarled trunks of the trees twisted upward like ancient sentinels. Their silver-green leaves shimmered softly in the cooling breeze, catching the amber light of the descending sun and scattering it in dappled patterns across the dry grass. Here, away from the pressing weight of the multitude, the air felt still and cool, carrying the faint, earthy aroma of olive oil and cooling stone. Jesus walked slowly up the incline, his bare feet treading lightly over the familiar path. His linen tunic, dust-stained from the day's journey, stirred gently in the evening wind. he reached out calloused fingers to touch the rough bark of a silver-leafed olive tree, pausing for a quiet moment to listen to the settling of the land as day yielded to dusk. Close behind him came the small knot of his closest companions. They moved with the heavy, unhurried gait of men accustomed to long days under the open sky, yet their shoulders bore a different kind of weariness. The public spectacle was over, but the questions remained, echoing in the quiet spaces of their minds like distant thunder over the hills. Simon Peter lagged a step behind the others, his thick, weathered brow furrowed in deep concentration. His broad, calloused hands more accustomed to hauling heavy fishing nets from the dark waters of the lake than to untangling abstract riddles, were clasped behind his back. The fisherman's impulsive heart, usually quick to speak or act, felt unusually heavy tonight. He looked out over the rolling landscape, watching the shadows pool in the valleys where the thin soil met the unforgiving limestone bedrock. Beside Peter stood Jonathan, the tenant farmer who had lingered on the fringes of the group, unsure of his place among these fishermen and zealots. Jonathan's fingers traced the deep cracks in his own palms, rough as dry bark. He had spent his entire life coaxing life from stubborn ground, watching the bitter north wind wither his barley or sudden spring rains wash away his newly turned seed. The parable of the sower had struck too close to home. It tasted of dust and disappointment, yet it carried an inexplicable resonance that he could not simply walk away from. Jesus seated himself upon a smooth, moss-dusted boulder beneath the sprawling canopy of the oldest olive tree. The trunk behind him had hollowed with age, a testament to decades of enduring drought and sudden winter gales, yet its upper branches still heavy with green fruit testified to a deep, hidden resilience. He motioned with a quiet gesture for the men to draw near. They gathered in a loose semicircle upon the cool grass. Some sat with their knees drawn to their chests, while others leaned back against the trunks of neighboring trees, letting out long, slow breaths that signaled the true beginning of rest. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the olive leaves overhead and the distant, plaintive bleat of a stray sheep high up on the rocky pasture. Simon Peter shifted his weight, clearing his throat softly. The silence of the grove seemed to press against his ribs, demanding an answer to the confusion that churned within him. "Master," Peter began, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying the rough cadence of the lakeside. He looked up, his dark eyes searching the calm, unhurried face of the teacher. "Why do you speak to them in parables? Why the riddles? To us, it is as though a veil has been lifted, and we can see the shape of the kingdom moving through the fields. But to the crowds down there," he flicked a heavy thumb toward the darkening valley, "it is only poetry. It is just a pleasant story about farming, and then they turn around and go back to their nets and their plows, none the wiser." Jesus turned his gaze from the western horizon, where the sky was burning with streaks of bruised violet and molten gold, and looked directly at Peter. There was no rebuke in his eyes, only a profound, patient depth that seemed to reach past the fisherman's bluster straight to the restless heart beneath. "To you," Jesus said, his voice low and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the cooling air of the grove, "it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. But to those who remain outside, everything comes in riddles. So that seeing they may see, and not perceive, and hearing they may hear, and not understand." The words hung in the quiet air, dense and heavy with meaning. Jonathan the farmer frowned, leaning forward slightly, his calloused hands resting on his knees. He knew well the difference between looking at a field and truly seeing it. A careless eye saw only a uniform stretch of brown dirt, but a farmer's eye saw the moisture content of the crust, the hidden nests of weeds just beneath the surface, the subtle depressions where water would pool and rot the roots. It is not that the truth is hidden to torment them, Jesus continued, his gaze sweeping gently over the small circle of men. A light is not placed under a basket, it is set on a lampstand so that all who enter may find their way. But sight requires an open eye, and understanding requires a willing heart. If a man's heart is as hard as the beaten path beside the road, the seed of the kingdom simply bounces off the surface. It finds no purchase. And before it can even begin to soften, the birds of the air, the anxious thoughts, the sudden distractions of the day, come along and snatch it away before a single root can form. Peter nodded slowly, recalling the crowds pressing around them on the flat shore that very morning. He remembered the blank, fleeting expressions on the faces of merchants and travelers who had paused for a moment to listen before rushing off to the market stalls in Capernaum. They had heard the words, perhaps even marveled at the music of the rabbi's voice, but the message had vanished from their minds the moment a stray donkey brayed or a coin dropped in the dust. "Do you not see?" Jesus asked softly, picking up a small, smooth pebble from the grass, turning it over between his fingers. "The soil is the heart of man. The sower sows the word, scattering it with a generous, reckless hand across every kind of ground, holding nothing back. He does not waste time analyzing whether the earth is worthy, he scatters because that is the nature of the seed." Jonathan let out a low, breathy sigh that sounded like the wind rustling through dry stubble. "I have scattered seed upon stony ground," the farmer murmured, half to himself. "Places where the earth looks deep enough from a distance, where the spring rains make everything look green and promising for a week or two. But when the summer heat beats down day after day, the crop withers away to nothing because there is no depth. There is no moisture down below." Jesus looked at Jonathan with an expression of gentle acknowledgement. "That is the rocky ground, Jonathan. That is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Oh, they feel the warmth of it. Their emotions are stirred, and they leap toward the light like tender green shoots after a spring shower. But because they have no root in themselves, because they have never dug deep into the quiet places of endurance, because they fold at the first hint of trouble or persecution, when affliction or hardship arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. The shadows beneath the olive trees deepened, turning from indigo to a soft, velvety charcoal. The evening chill began to settle over the hillside, causing the men to pull their woolen mantles more tightly around their shoulders. The warmth of the day was fading fast, replaced by the crisp, invigorating bite of the Galilean night. "And the thorny ground?" Andrew asked quietly from the shadows of a neighboring trunk, his voice hesitant. "What of the thorns that choke the life out of things?" Jesus set the pebble down upon the moss. "The thorns are the cares of this world," he said, his tone taking on a solemn, tender weight. "The deceitfulness of riches, the relentless pull of ambition, the quiet anxieties about what you will eat or what you will wear, the desire for things that glitter and pass away. These things do not always look like vicious weeds at first. Sometimes they look like useful plants or small concerns that demand just a little bit of attention. But they grow alongside the good seed, drawing the moisture from the soil, blocking the sunlight, crowding out the quiet spaces until the soul is suffocated by its own busyness. The word is there, buried somewhere beneath the tangled roots of 100 daily worries, but it becomes unfruitful. It cannot breathe. Silence descended upon the grove once more, deeper and more profound this time. Each man sat in the quiet theatre of his own conscience, measuring the soil of his own heart against the Master's words. They thought of their ambitions for the kingdom, their dreams of restored thrones, of vindication, of power over their oppressors, and how easily those grand desires could become thick, choking briars, twisting around the simple, fragile life of divine grace. Then there is the good ground, Jesus said, and his voice seemed to lift the heavy veil of introspection, carrying a note of quiet, certain triumph. The soil that is plowed, and harrowed, and cleared of stones. The earth that is deep enough to hold the moisture through the long, dry months of summer. These are the ones who hear the word with a noble and good heart, holding it fast, and bear fruit with patience. Peter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring intently at the dust between his feet. Patience, the fisherman murmured, tasting the word as if it were something heavy and strange. We are so often in a hurry, Master. We want the harvest the moment the seed hits the dirt. We want the kingdom to arrive with a shout and a sword. A seed does not grow because you shout at it, Simon, Jesus said, a faint, warm smile touching the corners of his mouth. It grows in the dark. It swells in silence. It sends its root downward into the cold, unseen earth before a single green blade dares to show its face to the sun. The mystery of the kingdom is the mystery of patience. It is the quiet persistence of life working against the hard edges of the world. Jonathan looked up, his rough hands resting open on his thighs. The skepticism that had marked his face earlier in the day had softened into something resembling wonder. He knew the agony of waiting for a harvest, the long weeks of watching a barren field under a pitiless sky, wondering if his labor had been in vain. Yet he also knew the quiet, breathtaking joy of walking out at dawn after a night of gentle rain to find the first pale green shoots breaking through the dark crust of the earth, reaching upward toward the light. 30-fold, Jonathan whispered, quoting the ancient measure of the harvest. Sometimes 60. Sometimes 100. Yes, Jesus said, his eyes shining softly in the twilight. An exponential harvest from a single, quiet grain. Not by human might, not by the clamor of the crowd, but by the steady, unyielding power of leaf itself. The sun slipped entirely below the western ridge, leaving behind a glowing amber band of light that slowly bled into deep indigo. The first stars began to pierce the velvet dome of the night sky, cold and brilliant above the quiet hills of Galilee. The wind died down completely, leaving the olive grove wrapped in a profound, velvety stillness. The men remained seated for a long time, reluctant to break the spell of the gathering dusk. The weariness of the journey had not vanished, but it had changed its character. It was no longer the restless, anxious fatigue of men striving against the wind, but the deep, satisfying tiredness of laborers who had laid down their tools at the end of a long day well done. Jesus stood up slowly, brushing a few stray bits of dried grass from the hem of his tunic. He looked around the circle at the faces of his friends, half hidden in the gathering dark, their expressions softened by the stillness of the night. "Let us go down," Jesus said gently, turning his face toward the winding path that led back to the shelter of the village below. They rose together, stretching their stiff limbs, and followed him down the hillside. The path was dark now, shadowed by the steep banks and the overarching branches of the scrub oak, but they walked with a new sureness of foot. They did not speak as they descended into the valley. The night air was cool against their skin, carrying the familiar scents of wood smoke, damp earth, and the distant, sleeping waters of the lake. Far below, a few oil lamps flickered in the windows of the stone houses of Capernaum, tiny points of warm light glowing steadily against the vast expanse of the evening. The world outside the grove was still restless, still caught up in its endless cycles of ambition, anxiety, and toil, but within the hearts of the men who walked behind the teacher, something quiet and deep had taken root in the dark. They moved through the shadows with steady, unhurried steps, listening to the quiet rhythm of the earth beneath their feet, waiting for the dawn. The pale, silvery grey of dawn crept slowly over the jagged ridges of the eastern hills, casting long, cool shadows across the quiet olive grove where the small company had rested. Miriam sat on a low stone bench near the edge of the terrace, her fingers absently tracing the rough grain of her woolen shawl as she watched the morning mist lift in thin, ghostly ribbons from the glassy surface of the Sea of Galilee below. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of damp earth, wild mint, and the sharp, clean fragrance of dew-soaked grass. Around them, the world was waking with a gentle murmur, a distant goat bell tinkling from a rocky slope, the soft rustle of silver-green leaves stirring in the first waking breath of the morning wind, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of distant waves lapping against the pebbled shore. Jesus stood a few paces away, looking out over the terraced hillsides that cascaded down toward the water. The golden light of the rising sun caught the edges of his sun-weathered cloak, illuminating the quiet lines around his eyes, lines forged by countless hours of walking dusty roads, listening to the sorrows of the broken, and gazing into the hidden depths of human hearts. He was holding a small handful of dark, ordinary earth that he had scooped from the base of an ancient olive tree, letting the dry, powdery grain slip slowly between his fingers until nothing remained but the faint scent of dust and life. Simon Peter stepped out from the shelter of a stone overhang, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with the back of a calloused hand. His brow was furrowed with the heavy, lingering confusion of the previous day. For all his fierce loyalty, the fisherman's mind was still tangled in the loud expectations of political liberation, of sweeping kingdoms forged with iron and fire, rather than the strange, quiet metaphors the teacher favored. He walked over to where Jesus stood, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path, and looked down at the empty palm of the Master's hand. "The crowds are beginning to stir down by the shore," Peter said, his voice low and raspy with morning sleep. "They are whispering among themselves about the story of the sower. Some think it was merely a clever tale about autumn planting, a practical lesson for the harvest ahead. But others are unsettled. They feel the weight of it, yet none of them truly understand what the seeds and the soils have to do with the kingdom we have all been waiting for." Jesus turned slowly, his gaze resting upon Peter with a profound, unhurried gentleness that instantly quieted the restless urgency in the fisherman's chest. He did not offer a rebuke for the impatience that always seemed to bubble just beneath the surface of Peter's words. Instead, he motioned for the others, Miriam, John, and the handful of devoted followers who had lingered through the night, to draw closer around him in the shelter of the gnarled olive trees. "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God," Jesus said, his voice carrying that familiar, resonant warmth that seemed to fill the hollow spaces of the morning air. "But to those who remain outside, everything comes in parables, so that looking they may look and not perceive, and hearing they may hear and not understand. Not because the door is barred against them, but because the ear of the heart has not yet learned to listen." Miriam leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed intently on his face. She remembered the vast multitude gathered on the sloping shore the day before, the thousands of anxious faces upturned toward the boat, the restless shifting of people burdened by debts, sickness, and the grinding weariness of Roman occupation. To them, the parable had been a picture of farming. But sitting here in the quiet sanctuary of the dawn, she sensed that the soil Jesus spoke of was not the red earth of the Galilean hills at all, but the hidden landscape of human consciousness. "Tell us plainly," Miriam murmured, her voice soft as the breeze through the olive branches. "Unveil the mystery of the soils, Master. Show us why some hearts receive your words with joy only to let them wither, while others seem deaf from the very beginning." Jesus nodded, looking down once more at the patch of ground where the seed had fallen. He began to walk slowly along the narrow terrace, his footsteps light upon the earth, and the disciples fell in step beside him, moving together like a single, reflective organism. "Consider first the seed that fell along the footpath," Jesus began, gesturing toward the well-trodden dirt path that wound just outside the stone wall of the grove. "That path has been beaten hard by the constant passage of travelers, merchants, and pack animals. Day after day, hundreds of feet have compressed the soil until it is as hard and impenetrable as the limestone bedrock lying just beneath the surface. When the sower casts his seed there, it does not sink. It rests upon the surface, vulnerable and exposed." Peter looked down at the hard-packed earth of the path beneath his own sandals, feeling the stubborn resistance of the ground. "And what happens to that seed?" Peter asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The birds of the air descend swiftly and snatch it away before it can even begin to swell with moisture," Jesus replied. "This is what happens when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, or lets it sit only on the surface of their thoughts. The evil one comes, or simply the frantic noise of the world, the rushing anxieties of daily survival, and steals away what was sown in their heart. The mind is too crowded with traffic, too hardened by routine, for the truth to find a single crack to enter." They walked a little further along the terrace, where the sunlight was beginning to warm the face of a low stone wall. Here, the ground was different, strewn with loose, grey limestone rocks that absorbed the heat of the sun during the day and radiated it back into the night. "And here," Jesus said, pausing beside a patch of earth where jagged shards of white stone broke through the thin, dusty surface. "Here we find the rocky ground. At first glance, it looks like good earth. A person walks here and thinks they have found a promising place for planting. But just beneath a shallow dusting of soil lies a solid shelf of hidden bedrock." Miriam knelt down, brushing away a light layer of dry dirt with her fingertips until her nails tapped against the cold, unyielding stone just an inch below. She looked up at Jesus with sudden comprehension. "The roots have no depth," she said softly. "They have no depth," Jesus agreed, his eyes reflecting the pale morning sky. "When the seed falls here, it sprouts quickly because the thin soil warms rapidly in the morning sun. The green shoot bursts forth with startling speed, and the beholder rejoices, thinking a great harvest has already begun. But because there is no depth of earth, no cool reservoir of moisture hidden beneath, the roots can go no further. They hit the stone. And when the sun rises high in the heavens, when the heat of affliction, trial, or persecution beats down upon that life, the plant has nothing to draw upon. Withering begins at the hidden tips of the roots, and because it has no root, it falls away." A deep, reflective silence settled over the group. Each of them thought of moments in their own lives when enthusiasm had flared brightly like dry grass, only to flicker and die when the first real hardship or social pressure tested their resolve. They had all known the danger of a faith that levered entirely in the sunlit shallows, never daring to dig down into the dark, cold places where real endurance was forged. Jesus moved on, leading them toward a slight depression in the hillside where wild thistles, briars, and thorny scrub bushes choked the margins of the terrace. The soil here was deep enough, dark and rich with promise, yet it was already densely occupied. And then, Jesus continued, his voice taking on a tone of quiet warning, "We come to the ground choked with thorns." He reached out and touched a tangled briar laden with sharp, needle-like points, careful not to pierce his skin. "These are the ones who hear the word," Jesus explained, "but the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things enter in and crowd out the word. It is not that they reject the truth. It is not that their hearts are hard like the path, or shallow like the rock. Their problem is division. They try to cultivate two harvests at once in the same narrow plot." Peter crossed his arms, his expression tightening as he recognized the subtle trap. The desire to succeed, to secure one's household, to be free from the constant fear of poverty, are these not natural things? They are the very air of this age, Simon, Jesus answered gently. Like thorns, these anxieties and ambitions do not appear as monsters, they look small at first, like harmless shoots of green. But they grow faster than the crop of the kingdom. They throw out long, underground runners that steal the moisture and the light. The plant of the word struggles upward, but it is squeezed on every side by the press of worries about tomorrow, by the quiet, intoxicating lure of possessions, by the endless hunger for what others have. And under that suffocating canopy, it becomes unfruitful. It leaves, but it never bears grain. The sun was now fully clear of the eastern hills, flooding the valley of Gennesaret with a warm, amber brilliance. The morning chill had vanished, replaced by the comfortable, radiant heat of a Galilean spring day. The rustling leaves of the olive trees danced in the light, casting a shimmering mosaic of shadow and gold across the shoulders of the listening disciples. Finally, Jesus led them to the lowest tier of the terrace, where the soil was rich, dark, and deeply tilled. Here, the earth had been turned by the plough, softened by autumn rains, and cleared of stones and weeds. It smelled sweet, heavy, and intensely alive. Yet Jesus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that commanded their absolute attention, "There is another soil. The seed that falls on good ground, these are the ones who hear the word, who accept it, and who hold it fast in an honest and good heart. He knelt down and picked up a handful of this dark, crumbling earth, letting it rest openly in his palm. "Look at it," Jesus whispered. "It is ordinary dirt. It has no pride of its own. It is willing to be broken by the plow, willing to let the seed sink deep into its darkness, willing to wait in patience through the cold nights while the invisible work of germination takes place beneath the surface." Miriam knelt beside him, watching the way the sunlight caught the fine texture of the soil. "And the harvest?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly with a profound, dawning hope. "What is the fruit of such patience?" "Some yield 100-fold," Jesus said, a quiet joy lighting his face, "some 60, and some 30. Not all through frantic effort, not all in the same measure, but all through the quiet, unstoppable mystery of life working from within. The kingdom of God is not forced upon the world like a tower built by human hands. It is like a seed sown by a farmer who sleeps and rises night and day, while the seed sprouts and grows, he knows not how. The earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear." He stood up, brushing the dark soil from his hands, and looked out over the vast expanse of the landscape where the people were already beginning to gather along the lake shore, their voices carrying faintly up the hillside like the humming of bees. "He who has ears to hear," Jesus said softly, turning back to his companions with a smile that seemed to contain the light of the entire morning, "let him hear." Peter stood in silence, the weight of the old political ambitions finally dissolving away from his spirit, replaced by a strange, steady peace. He looked at the rich earth clinging to the hem of his tunic, then out at the sparkling sea, realizing for the first time that the true revolution of the kingdom was not about conquering territories out there, but about allowing the hard, crowded soil of the human heart to be broken, healed, and open to the quiet working of grace. Miriam rose slowly to her feet, taking a deep breath of the fragrant morning air. The mystery of the kingdom was no longer a riddle wrapped in obscure metaphors, it was an invitation. An invitation to stop running on the hard paths of anxiety, to pull up the suffocating thorns of distraction, to dig past the shallow stones of superficial emotion, and to let the word of life sink deep into the quiet, waiting darkness of the soul. Around them, the day unfolded in all its unhurried beauty. The shadows shortened, the golden light warmed every leaf and stone, and the small company stood together on the hillside, listening to the gentle murmur of the world waking up to a new and enduring dawn. The golden hours of the Galilean afternoon dissolved slowly, melting from amber into the soft, bruised violet of early evening across the rolling hills. Long shadows stretched out from the olive trees, fingers of cool shade reaching across the dusty footpaths where the crowds had gathered earlier that day. Slowly, by twos and threes, the listeners had begun to disperse, their sandals crunching softly on the gravel as they wound their way down toward the whitewashed stone houses of Capernaum or out toward the scattered encampments nestled in the sheltered hollows of the hills. Yet a small company remained, reluctant to break the spell of the hillside. They had gathered near a low stone terrace overlooking the vast, darkening basin of the Sea of Galilee. Simon Peter sat heavily on a weathered boulder, his thick calloused hands resting upon his knees. His broad shoulders, usually taut with the restless energy of a fisherman who constantly scanned the horizon for squalls or hauled heavy nets from the water, were noticeably slack. the fierce, impatient questions that so often bubbled up inside him, the burning desire for a sudden, thunderous kingdom that would sweep away Roman legions and restore Israel to glory, seemed strangely distant tonight. Instead, his mind drifted back over the parable of the sower, turning the soil of his own impetuous heart over and over. He thought of the hard-packed path where the seed could find no entrance, where the birds of the air snatched the truth away before it could even begin to soften. He winced inwardly, remembering how quickly his own enthusiasm could flare and fade when the trials of the day pressed in like scorching heat upon shallow soil. Yet, looking out across the darkening water, a quiet resolve settled deep within his chest. He did not need to understand every detail of tomorrow. For tonight, it was enough simply to let the word sink into the quiet, waiting darkness of his soul, trusting that a deeper, sturdier root system was taking hold beneath the surface of his turbulent spirit. Not far away, Jonathan the tenant farmer leaned his back against the rough trunk of an ancient olive tree, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. His hands, scarred by decades of wrestling with stubborn rocks, unyielding clay, and unpredictable drought, felt heavy at his sides. For all his life, Jonathan had measured his worth by the bushel, by the grueling sweat of his brow, by the meager tally of grain brought to the threshing floor after the thistles and thorns had choked out half his labor. But tonight, listening to the Nazarene speak of seeds falling into different soils, a strange and unexpected peace had begun to thaw the bitter skepticism in his chest. He realized that the master teacher was not offering a simple agricultural manual for guaranteed crop yields, nor was he condemning the farmer for the stubbornness of the earth. Rather, he was naming the hidden landscape of human grief, the quiet heartbreak of toil that seemed to yield nothing. Jonathan watched the first stars begin to puncture the velvety expanse of the night sky, their distant light trembling in the cool evening air. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain from his aching joints. The land would rest tonight, lying fallow under the infinite, watching heavens, and so would he. There was no more need to strive against the rocks, no more need to curse the thorns. The mystery of the kingdom was at work beneath the surface, quiet and unstoppable, far beyond the reach of human anxiety. Beside him, Miriam of Magdala sat cross-legged on the cool grass, her dark eyes reflecting the brilliant constellation of the Milky Way as it arched overhead like a river of spilled silver. Her heart, once a fractured landscape haunted by storms and shadows, felt wonderfully still, as though a great and gentle wind had swept through the rooms of her mind and carried away every lingering fear. She traced the edge of a smooth pebble with her thumb, marveling at how truth had entered her life not with the crash of an earthquake, but like a tiny seed falling silently into dark, fertile earth. She understood now why some hearts remained impervious while others blossomed. It was a matter of surrender, of allowing the hard crust of self-protection to be broken open by grace. The night deepened, wrapping the Galilean hills in a mantle of profound and velvety darkness. The breeze that swept down from the crest of Mount Arbel carried the crisp, cool scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint, salty tang of the distant lake, whispering through the silver-grey leaves of the olive groves with a sound like a soft, rhythmic lullaby. Down in the valleys, the scattered hearth fires of the villages flickered like fallen stars, casting warm, orange glows against the whitewashed walls of stone cottages before winking out one by one as the inhabitants surrendered to sleep. The world grew hushed. The frantic hum of daytime insects faded into the steady, pulsing cadence of crickets hidden in the tall meadow grass. High above, the Galilean stars blazed in magnificent, unhurried splendor, wheeling slowly across the vast celestial dome in a silent, eternal dance. There was no haste in their movement, no anxiety in their light. They simply shone, fulfilling their ancient purpose in the quiet sanctuary of the night. Simon Peter closed his eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the distant shore, and felt his breathing match the slow, steady rhythm of the earth settling into rest. Jonathan let his head tilt back against the sturdy bark of the olive tree, his weary muscles letting go of the day's burdens, completely content to leave the harvest in hands greater than his own. Miriam breathed in the cool night air, feeling the deep, abiding warmth of a peace that surpassed all understanding take root in the quiet garden of her heart. The hills slept. The valley slept. The seeds lay hidden in the rich, dark earth, resting beneath the watchful canopy of the stars, waiting in the silent, fertile night for the dawn of a new and unending day. The hours before dawn possessed a quality of stillness that seemed almost sacred, a velvet hush in which the olive trees cast long, silver shadows across the terraced hillsides of Galilee. Old Eli, whose joints had weathered more seasons than he cared to count, sat quietly near the stone hearth of his courtyard, wrapped in a coarse woolen cloak that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. Beside him, the glowing embers of the fire offered a gentle, pulsing warmth against the crisp morning air, painting the wrinkles of his weathered face in shades of amber and rose. He listened to the faint, distant bleating of sheep high up on the slopes of Mount Arbel, a comforting reminder that the world was slowly stirring toward another day of simple labor. Jonathan stepped softly across the packed earth of the courtyard, carrying a small clay jug of fresh goat's milk and 2 wooden cups he had carved himself during the long winter evenings. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who understood that haste only troubled the spirit, and that the morning hour demanded a reverence all its own. Setting the cups upon a low wooden stool, he poured the cool milk with a steady hand, the liquid catching the first pale, pearlescent glow of dawn creeping over the eastern ridge. The air carries the scent of rain tonight, or perhaps just the heavy dew of the valley, Jonathan murmured, his voice low and rich like turned soil, blending harmoniously with the morning chorus of the waking sparrows. Eli smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening as he reached out a gnarled hand to accept the cup. The earth remembers the promise of the early rains, Jonathan, even when the surface appears dry and stubborn under the glare of the noon sun. Just like the heart of a man, which often hides its deepest longings beneath layers of dust and daily toil. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the coolness refresh him before looking out toward the terraced fields that sloped gently down toward the shimmering expanse of the Sea of Galilee. Yesterday, upon the hillside, when the teacher spoke of the seed scattered upon the 4 kinds of ground, I found myself thinking of my own youth, of the stony patches I spent half a lifetime clearing, only to find deeper rocks buried beneath. Jonathan nodded, sitting down on an upturned log and resting his forearms upon his knees. His gaze followed the contour of the winding footpath that disappeared into the silver-green orchards of the lower valley. It is easy to let the stones accumulate, Jonathan reflected quietly. We clear a space for planting, but then the distractions of the market, the anxieties of the harvest, and the constant press of daily survival roll in like loose shale from the upper ridge. Before we realize it, the soil of our attention is choked, and there is no room left for anything of lasting weight to take root. Yet the sower keeps scattering, Eli said softly, gesturing toward the horizon where the first brilliant sliver of gold was piercing the violet clouds above the hills of Golan. He does not look at the footpath and withhold his hand. He does not walk past the thorns and say it is a waste. He scatters with an extravagant, reckless grace, trusting that somewhere, in the hidden folds of the earth, a heart is finally becoming soft enough to listen. As they spoke, the pale light grew, washing the landscape in soft shades of lavender, gold, and dusty olive green. Down by the lake shore, the mists were beginning to lift in lazy, curling ribbons, revealing the wooden hulls of fishing boats bobbing gently against the wooden piers of Capernaum. Miriam of Magdala walked alone along the pebbled shore, her sandals crunching softly against the smooth stones polished by centuries of gentle waves. The cool water brushed against her toes, sending a shiver of pure, waking life through her limbs, while overhead, the sky transitioned from indigo to a vast, clear expanse of morning blue. Miriam carried no burden this morning save for the quiet joy that rested deep within her chest like a glowing ember. She paused by a cluster of wild mustard plants that grew abundantly near the edge of the freshwater spring, their slender stalks swaying gracefully in the morning breeze. She remembered the tumultuous days before she had met Jesus, the relentless storms of her own mind, the frantic searching through shadows, the constant, exhausting friction of a spirit divided against itself. That life now felt like a distant dream, a winter season that had finally yielded to the undeniable warmth of a new spring. The teacher had not offered complex philosophies or impossible ladders of merit. He had simply spoken of a kingdom hidden in plain sight, a treasure buried in a common field, a tiny seed that possessed within its microscopic heart the entire blueprint of a mighty tree. Farther along the path, Simon Peter trudged upward from the docks, his broad shoulders slightly bowed from a long night of casting nets into the deep, dark waters. Though the catch had been modest, his spirit was strangely light, untroubled by the empty spaces in the bottom of the boat. He wiped the salt spray from his forehead with the back of his calloused hand and breathed in the rich, earthy fragrance of damp soil mingling with the scent of wild thyme crushed underfoot. When Peter reached the courtyard where Eli and Jonathan sat in companionable silence, he offered a low, rumbling greeting and sank onto a stone bench with a long, contented sigh. The lake was as glass before the dawn, Peter said, resting his thick forearms on his knees. Not a ripple to be found, save for the occasional flash of a silver fish breaking the surface. It makes a man realize how much noise we make inside our own heads, worrying about the wind, when the water simply obeys the rhythm of the earth and sky. We spend our lives trying to force the harvest, Jonathan observed, passing a cup of cool milk to the fisherman, who accepted it with a grateful nod. We pull at the stalks before they are ready, or we fret over the birds that steal the surface grain, forgetting that the real work, the mysterious, invisible alchemy of growth, happens entirely beneath the surface, where no human eye can peer. Eli gazed out across the vast panorama of Galilee, where the golden sunlight was now spilling in a magnificent cascade over the terraced hills, touching every olive grove, every stone wall, and every winding footpath with brilliant clarity. The mystery of the kingdom, the old man whispered, his voice trembling slightly with awe, is that it does not demand our perfection, it only asks for our permission. It asks us to let the soil of our hearts be broken open, to let the stones be gathered, to let the thorns be pulled away so that the word of life might finally drop into a place of deep, undisturbed rest. The sun climbed higher, warming the stones of the courtyard and bathing the gathered companions in a golden, luminous glow. No further words were needed. The morning breeze rustled through the ancient olive leaves, whispering an ancient, reassuring melody across the hills of Galilee, a song of patient earth, faithful sowing, and the quiet, certain promise of an abundant harvest yet to come. The midday sun eventually crested the jagged ridges of the eastern hills, casting a heavy, golden amber sheen across the terraced vineyards and the sprawling, olive-dusted plains of Lower Galilee. Down along the shoreline of the lake, where the water lapped in gentle, rhythmic pulses against the basalt pebbles, the heat rose in shimmering, translucent waves that blurred the boundary between the shimmering blue surface of the sea and the pale, cloudless expanse of the sky. Jonathan the tenant farmer wiped the sweat from his forehead with the rough back of a calloused hand, leaning his weight against the sturdy haft of his wooden hoe. His muscles ached with a familiar, honest fatigue, the kind that came from sun-up labor in earth that refused to yield its treasures without a struggle. Around him, the rest of the small gathering had begun to disperse from the shaded courtyard of old Eli's stone dwelling, moving quietly in twos and threes down the sloping footpaths toward the cool shade of the lakeside or the shelter of the village proper. Miriam of Magdala walked slowly along the narrow path that wound between two ancient stone terraces, her footsteps silent upon the sun-baked dust. She carried a small clay pitcher of cool water, its porous sides weeping moisture to combat the dry heat of the afternoon. Her thoughts drifted back to the parables spoken just hours before by the shore, the images of seed scattering blindly across paths, rocky ledges, thorn-choked patches, and finally, the dark, yielding furrows of good ground. She felt a profound resonance within her own spirit, recognizing the hidden corners of her own heart where anxious thoughts and the heavy cares of the world often threatened to choke out the quiet voice of peace. A short distance ahead, Simon Peter walked with a measured, heavy tread, his broad shoulders slightly slumped as he absorbed the weight of the teacher's words. The fisherman was a man accustomed to the tangible results of hauling nets. Either the mesh was heavy with shimmering, thrashing life, or it came up empty and clean, stinging his palms with salt and disappointment. This new language of seeds, hidden growth, and invisible roots baffled his pragmatic mind, yet it stirred a deep, restless longing in his chest. He stopped beside an ancient carob tree, whose sprawling canopy offered a temporary reprieve from the relentless glare, and waited for the others to catch up. "It is a strange way to run a kingdom," Peter murmured softly as Miriam drew near, offering him the clay pitcher with a quiet, knowing smile. He accepted it, murmuring his thanks before taking a long, refreshing draught that cooled his parched throat. We spend our lives looking for swords, for power, for a sudden stroke of divine intervention that might shatter the Roman yoke once and for all. And yet he speaks of a farmer scattering seed in the dirt, trusting the wind and the soil to do the work while he sleeps. "Perhaps," Miriam replied, her voice as calm and steady as the deep wells of Nazareth, "we have spent so much time looking for the thunder that we have forgotten how to listen to the rain." The kingdom he speaks of does not conquer by force, Simon. It permeates. It takes root in the quietest, most overlooked places of the human soul, growing silently until it reshapes everything from the inside out. Further down the slope, where the path narrowed between high walls of dry-stacked basalt stones, Jesus walked alone for a time, though his companions kept a respectful, reverent distance. The atmosphere of the Galilean countryside at this hour was thick with the scent of wild thyme, sun-warmed dust, and the resinous fragrance of nearby terebinth trees. Cicadas kept up a steady, droning chorus in the olive groves, a hypnotic pulse that seemed to measure out the slow, eternal cadence of the afternoon. The historical weight of the land pressed in from every direction. Beneath their sandals lay centuries of human toil, generations of ploughmen, shepherds, and vintners who had coaxed sustenance from these very hills under the rule of Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and now the iron grip of Caesar's legions. Every terrace wall had been built stone by back-breaking stone by hands long since turned to dust. Every cistern had been carved out of the living rock to catch the meager winter rains. Into this ancient, weary landscape of survival and subjugation, the message of the sower fell like water upon parched ground, offering an entirely different kind of liberation, one that began not with the overthrow of governments, but with the surrender of the stubborn heart. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, stretching long and indigo across the dusty paths, the small company regrouped near the shore where a cluster of wooden fishing boats lay moored to wooden stakes. The water had turned from brilliant turquoise to a deep, molten copper as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Old Eli, who had insisted on walking down the hill despite his advanced years, sat upon an overturned boat hull, his gnarled hands resting upon a knotted walking staff. He looked out across the glassy expanse of the lake, watching a solitary pelican glide low across the surface before dipping down to break the water in search of its evening meal. "The day wanes," the old man said quietly as Jesus approached and seated himself on the pebbled shore beside him. "And the questions remain, Master. If the seed is good and the sower is generous, why does so much of it come to nothing? Why must the path be hard, the rocks hidden, and the thorns so eager to reclaim what was sown?" Jesus picked up a smooth, water-worn pebble from the shore, turning it over slowly in his fingers before casting it gently back into the water, where it vanished with a soft splash and a widening circle of ripples. "Because life, true life, cannot be manufactured, Eli," Jesus answered, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle lapping of the waves. "It requires a voluntary vulnerability. A seed that refuses to fall to the earth and be broken remains alone, safe and unchanged in the granary. But once it drops into the dark, once it surrenders its hard shell to the moisture and pressure of the soil, everything changes. The shell gives way. The darkness presses in. And in that hidden place of apparent destruction, the first fragile pulse of life begins to beat." The company gathered close, sitting upon the warm stones of the shoreline as the first cool breath of evening began to drift down from the surrounding heights of the Golan. Jonathan the tenant farmer listened intently, realizing with a sudden, quiet clarity that his daily labor in the fields was not merely a means to earn bread, but a Levi-ng parable enacted every single season beneath the wide, indifferent sky. Every time he turned the heavy soil with his plow, every time he cleared the intrusive roots of thornbush from the furrows, he was participating in a divine mystery far greater than his own small life. The sun dipped lower, touching the crest of the western hills and setting the sky ablaze with streaks of violet, rose, and brilliant gold. The day's heat finally dissolved into a refreshing coolness, and the sounds of the surrounding countryside softened into the tranquil hum of approaching twilight. In that quiet hour by the Galilean shore, surrounded by the timeless elements of earth, water, and fading light, the companions rested in the profound assurance that no effort made in the service of truth was ever truly lost, and that the quiet work sown in the secret places of the heart would surely, in its own time, rise to meet the dawn. The twilight deepened over the tranquil expanse of the Sea of Galilee, casting a deep, velvety indigo across the water where late-returning fishermen patched their nets by the shore. Simon Peter sat heavily upon a weathered boulder near the water's edge, his calloused hands turning a smooth, round pebble over and over as the ripples lapped softly against the basalt stones. The events of the day, the crowds pressing close upon the green slopes, the rich scent of turned earth, and the quiet, persistent cadence of the Master's voice explaining the hidden things of the kingdom, lingered in the cooling air like the sweet residue of incense. Beside him, Miriam of Magdala pulled her woolen shawl tighter against the evening chill, her gaze fixed on the faint, shimmering path of the rising moon upon the gentle swells. Neither spoke for a long time, content to let the profound stillness of the hour weave its quiet remedy through their tired limbs and wandering thoughts. Further up the incline, near the stone-walled enclosure of Jonathan's olive grove, the flickering orange glow of a small hearth fire cast long, dancing shadows against the gnarled trunks of ancient trees. Jonathan himself knelt beside the low wall, carefully tending to a ceramic pot of lentil stew that simmered over the embers, while old Eli sat upon a low wooden stool, his blind eyes turned toward the warmth of the fire. The old man's face was lined with the accumulated patience of 80 years spent watching the skies and tending the stubborn soil of the lower hills. He reached out a trembling hand, letting his fingertips brush against the rough bark of the olive tree nearest him, tracing the deep fissures carved by decades of wind, rain, and relentless summer heat. "The soil remembers everything, Jonathan," old Eli murmured, his voice raspy yet remarkably steady in the quietude of the evening. "Every drop of rain that sinks deep into its core, and every heavy stone that was ever cleared from its path. A man might forget where he cast his seed in the haste of the spring planting, but the earth holds it close, guarding the mystery until the appointed hour arrives." Jonathan stirred the stew, the rich aroma of cumin and garlic rising into the cool night air. He looked out over the darkened expanse of the fields they had walked through just hours before, where the 4 distinct parcels of land, the trampled footpath, the shallow ledge of rock, the tangled patch of thorn, and the rich, receptive furrows, now rested beneath the quiet watch of the stars. The farmer felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition in his own chest, remembering the stubborn corners of his own heart that had so often resisted the gentle plowshare of truth, preferring the hard, familiar safety of well-worn habits to the vulnerability of radical change. "It is a hard thing," Jonathan confessed softly, the confession drawn from him by the absolute peace of the dark, to let the plow go deep enough to break the old stones. "We spend our whole lives building walls around our little plots, keeping the world out, only to realize we have kept the water out as well." Across the glowing embers, Jesus stepped quietly out from the shadow of the silver-leafed branches, his footsteps making scarcely a sound upon the carpet of fallen leaves. He did not look like a conqueror or a king, but like a man who belonged utterly to the dust of the road and the breath of the hills, simple, unassailable, and entirely at home in the quiet fabric of the world. He seated himself upon a flat stone opposite old Eli, reaching out to warm his hands over the flickering flame. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the deep, compassionate attentiveness in his eyes. "The stone in the field is never removed all at once," "Jonathan," Jesus said, his voice carrying the gentle rhythm of a flowing stream. It is loosened stone by stone, season by season, as the farmer walks his land with patience and steady hands. The kingdom of heaven does not arrive with the violence of a storm that tears the landscape apart. It comes as the seed comes, hidden beneath the surface, unnoticed by the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, working its silent transformation in the dark. The night grew deeper, the constellations wheeling slowly above the Galilean hills in their eternal, silent dance. Orion climbed higher into the velvet sky, and the distant barking of a shepherd's dog drifted across the valley from a neighboring ridge. The companions shared the simple meal of bread and warm lentil stew in a communion that required no elaborate words, for the shared silence held a weight far greater than speech. They were wanderers on a dusty road, yet in that small circle of firelight by the ancient olive trees, they felt the secure anchor of a reality that transcended the shifting empires of Rome and the anxious turbulence of their own troubled times. When the embers finally began to fade into glowing beds of ash, the company settled back into their woolen blankets, resting their heads upon packs and rolled cloaks. The crisp night wind whispered through the high branches of the terebinth trees, carrying the scent of wild hyssop and damp earth. Jonathan lay awake for a long time, watching the steady, unblinking light of the stars, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart syncing with the ancient, unhurried pulse of the land beneath him. With the first pale wash of silver along the eastern horizon, long before the sun had crested the distant hills of Bashan, the household stirred. The morning mist clung thickly to the lower valleys, a dense, white blanket that swallowed the base of the olive trees and turned the rolling slopes into islands floating upon a sea of cloud. Jesus stood alone at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the hidden landscape with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the morning vapors to the very heart of the waking world. Simon Peter joined him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and adjusting the heavy leather belt around his tunic. The fisherman took a deep breath of the damp, invigorating air, smelling the sharp fragrance of crushed mint and dew-soaked grass. "Where do we turn our feet today, Master?" Peter asked quietly, gesturing toward the winding footpath that descended past the rocky ledge toward the shores of Capernaum. "The crowds will be waiting by the docks before the sun clears the ridge." "We walk toward the lakeside," Jesus replied, turning his face toward the pale light of the new day. "There are nets to be hauled, and souls weary of the hard road who need to learn the gentle art of listening. Every footstep is a sowing, Simon. Let us walk so that the earth may receive us well." With those words, the small band of travelers gathered their belongings, stepped out from the sheltering embrace of the olive grove, and began their descent down the misty hillside. The path was narrow and steep, flanked by wild mustard flowers heavy with morning dew, and every step carried them deeper into the vibrant, breathing heart of Galilee. Behind them, the four soils lay waiting beneath the brightening sky, patient, silent, and infinitely receptive to the quiet unfolding of the day, while the golden light of the morning sun slowly dissolved the shadows, revealing a world made entirely new. The descent carried them through the terraced vineyards where stone walls, built by generations of patient hands, retained the warmth of the vanished night and offered a brief shelter against the rising breeze. Miriam of Magdala walked slightly apart from the others, her fingers lightly brushing the rough-hewn granite of the low fences, her mind wandering back to the images Jesus had drawn upon the dusty hillside just hours before. She thought of the footpath, hard-packed and impervious, beaten down by the relentless tramp of countless travelers, merchants, and Roman detachments until nothing could penetrate its crust. How often, she wondered, did human hearts grow callous in the same relentless fashion, hardening against the persistent whisper of grace simply because the traffic of daily survival left no room for pause? A hawk circled lazily in the pale blue dome above, riding an invisible thermal of rising air, its sharp cry piercing the quiet morning with a wild, untamed clarity that seemed to echo the uncompromising call of the kingdom. Ahead of them, Simon Peter strode with a heavy, deliberate gait, his calloused fisherman's hands clasped behind his back as he wrestled with the memory of his own impulsiveness. The rough wool of his tunic brushed against his shins with a steady, rhythmic rasp, keeping time with the crunch of gravel under his sandals. He was a man accustomed to the sudden violence of the lake, to squalls that blew down from the ravines with little warning, demanding instant action, hauling of ropes, and desperate steering against the trough of the waves. The patient, unhurried cadence of the sower's labor felt entirely foreign to his salt-seasoned soul. How was a man supposed to simply scatter seed and wait while weeds choked the life out of tender shoots, wait while the sun beat down mercilessly upon shallow earth? Yet, as he glanced sideways at the quiet, unperturbed figure of Jesus walking a few paces ahead, Peter felt the turbulent waters within his own chest begin to subside, calmed by an unspoken authority that required no shouting to make itself known. Jonathan, the tenant farmer, who had joined their company at the edge of the olive grove with a sack of tools slung over his narrow shoulder, pointed toward a grove of ancient terebinth trees clustered around a dry wadi bed. "The well of Shiloah is nearby," Jonathan murmured, his voice raspy from the morning dust and tinged with the weary resignation of one who spent his entire existence bargaining with an unpredictable sky. "The water runs low this late in the dry season, but the stone trough remains cool. Even the flocks know enough to gather there before the midday heat begins to shimmer off the basalt rocks." Jesus nodded, accepting the guidance with a gentle inclination of his head, and the little band adjusted their course, shifting from the main cart track toward a narrow sheep path overhung by wild fig branches that offered a dense, emerald canopy. The atmosphere beneath the fig trees changed abruptly, the harsh glare of the Galilean sun giving way to a dappled, cathedral-like gloom where the air smelled of damp earth, crushed leaves, and the sweet, fermenting scent of fallen fruit rotting quietly in the shade. Old Eli, leaning heavily upon a polished staff of wild almond wood, paused to catch his breath, his chest heaving slightly under his faded linen tunic. At 80 years of age, the old man had seen kingdoms rise and crumble like dry mud, had paid taxes to extortionate collectors, and had buried more sons and daughters than any parent should bear. "Master," Eli rasped, his voice trembling slightly as he leaned against a mossy boulder near the wellhead, "you spoke of soils that fail, of seeds devoured by birds and choked by thorns. Is there no land that is ready from the beginning? Must every heart endure the plough before it can truly hear?" Jesus stopped and turned, his eyes holding a depth that seemed to draw the very shadows of the grove into their quiet gaze. He reached down, picking up a handful of dark, crumbly earth from the base of the boulder, soil rich with the decayed history of countless seasons, softened by shade and moisture. "Eli," Jesus replied, his voice a low, resonant murmur that blended seamlessly with the rustle of leaves overhead, "no ground is born ready for the harvest. The earth must be broken, the stones must be gathered by hand and cast aside, and the deep roots of bitterness must be wrenched from the dark before the grain can find its way. The mystery of the kingdom is not that we are found pristine, but that we are willing to be dug deep enough for the water to reach our thirst. Miriam stepped closer, taking a small clay flask from her leather satchel and pouring a measured stream of cool water into the hollow of a clean stone basin for the old man. As Eli drank with trembling gratitude, the silence of the grove deepened, broken only by the distant, mournful cooing of a turtle dove hidden somewhere in the higher branches of the terebinth. They lingered there for a long hour, suspended between the demanding roads of the lowlands and the blue expanse of the lake that shimmered like hammered silver through a break in the foliage below, each member of the company turning over the quiet soil of their own private thoughts while the world outside marched on in its relentless pursuit of bread and power. The narrow path wound downward from the high grove of terebinth trees, descending through terrace slopes where generations of olive cultivators had coaxed sustenance from the stubborn, limestone-ribbed hills of Lower Galilee. Every footstep stirred the dry dust of late summer, releasing a pungent, herbal fragrance of wild oregano and sun-worn thyme that clung to the hem of Simon Peter's rough woolen tunic. He walked a few paces ahead of the others, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, his calloused hands clasped behind his back as he wrestled with the heavy cadence of the words they had just heard upon the hillside. Beside him, Jonathan the tenant farmer navigated the steep incline with the practiced ease of a man whose bones had long ago memorized the contours of this specific earth. He carried his empty seed basket tucked firmly under one arm, its woven reed smelling faintly of barley and ancient chaff, while his gaze scanned the terraced fields below with the perpetual, anxious calculation of a husbandman assessing his yields against the looming demands of tax collectors and unpredictable autumn rains. "The soil does not argue with the sower," Jonathan murmured softly, breaking a long stretch of companionable silence as they rounded a sharp outcrop of grey rock where a stunted fig tree offered a meagre patch of shade. His voice was gravelly, worn smooth by decades of shouting across windy furrows and listening to the dry rattle of parched stalks under a scorching sky. Whether the ground is hard as a threshing floor or deep and rich, the seed falls the same. It has always struck me as a terribly reckless way to farm. Jesus, walking just behind them with a steady, unhurried stride, turned his head toward the farmer and offered a quiet, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes against the brightening glare of the morning. Reckless, Jonathan? Or simply generous beyond the bounds of common prudence? "Prudence keeps a man from starving in a bad year," Jonathan replied, though there was no heat in his defense, only the weary wisdom of the furrow. "My father taught me to save the best handful of grain for the absolute best ground, the deep pockets of alluvial silt near the bottom of the valley where the winter stream deposits its richest silt. We never wasted precious seed on the stony ridges where the bedrock sits 2 fingers beneath the surface. To scatter grain indiscriminately along a beaten footpath where the village donkeys tread a dozen times a day, that is not farming. That is simply losing your livelihood to the wind and the birds." And yet, Jesus said, his voice dropping into that rich, resonant register that seemed to command the attention of the very stones beneath their sandals, "The Creator of the hills does not parcel out the morning sun only to the terraced gardens of the wealthy. The rain falls with equal impartiality upon the cultivated orchard and the barren rock. The mystery of the kingdom is not bound by the narrow arithmetic of human calculation." They paused where the path widened into a broad, dusty plateau overlooking the northern shore of the lake. Below them, The Sea of Galilee stretched out like a vast sheet of blue-gray glass, utterly calm save for the faint, shimmering ripples where a school of fish broke the surface near the distant mouth of the Jordan. Small clusters of whitewashed houses belonging to the village of Capernaum clung to the water's edge, their flat roofs dotted with drying nets and baskets of newly harvested figures. Thin plumes of grey smoke rose lazily into the crisp morning air from underground clay ovens, signaling the start of the day's domestic labor, while the distant, rhythmic thud of a wooden mallet came echoing across the water from a local boat builder's yard. Miriam of Magdala lingered a little way back, walking alongside old Eli, whose steps had slowed considerably as the gradient leveled out. She held his elbow with a gentle, reassuring firmness, guiding him away from loose gravel and sharp stones that might catch his sandals. The old man's breathing was shallow, whistling softly through his dry lips, but his eyes remained bright and remarkably clear as he surveyed the familiar panorama of his homeland spread out beneath the expanding dome of the morning sky. "I remember when these hillsides were thick with oak and terebinth," Eli whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he gestured with a gnarled finger toward the upper slopes where only sparse thornbush and scrub brush now survived. Before the timber was cleared for the Roman siege engines, before the charcoal burners stripped the ridges bare to feed the kilns of Sepphoris. The earth was softer then. It held the moisture long after the winter rains had ceased, weeping sweet water from 100 hidden springs that have long since turned to dust. "The land remembers, even when the trees are gone," Miriam said quietly, her gaze sweeping over the patchwork quilt of small, individually owned plots that checkered the valley floor. Each plot was demarcated by low stone walls, ancient boundary markers piled high by generations of brothers and neighbors, sometimes sparking bitter disputes over a single cubit of arable dirt. Just as a heart remembers how to listen, even after years of having to armor itself against the harshness of the world. Eli turned his weathered face toward her, the deep wrinkles around his eyes folding into an expression of profound curiosity. "You speak of the heart as if it were a garden, Miriam. But gardens require fences, gates, guards to keep the wild boars and the stray goats from devouring the tender shoots before they can take hold. Without protection, nothing of value survives in Galilee." "Perhaps," Miriam replied thoughtfully, her fingers brushing against the leather strap of her satchel. "Or perhaps the protection we build to keep out the pain ends up keeping out the rain as well. How many times have I bolted the door of my own mind against a sorrow so sharp I thought it would unmake me, only to realize later that I had also locked out the very grace that could have healed it." They walked on in silence for a time, descending further into the valley where the path narrowed between two high stone walls overhung with wild caper plants bursting with pale lavender blossoms. The air grew noticeably warmer here, trapped between the masonry, carrying the heavy, fertile scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation from a nearby irrigation ditch where green reeds and wild celery choked the slow-moving current. Along the base of the stone wall, thousands of small, brown-backed sparrows fluttered nervously among the dry stalks, rising in sudden, synchronized clouds whenever the travelers drew near, only to resettle instantly upon the beaten earth of the path to scavenge for stray seeds dropped by passing grain carts. The sheer abundance of the birds was astonishing. They lined the fences, perched upon the protruding lintels of wooden gates, and squabbled noisily in the dust, their sharp, incessant chirping forming a vibrant, restless chorus that seemed to fill the entire valley. Jonathan paused, pointing a calloused finger toward a flock of the tiny birds that descended with frantic greed upon a patch of ground where a farmer had evidently spilled a small measure of barley earlier that morning. "Look at them," the farmer muttered, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and professional disdain. "They do not sow, they do not reap, they build no barns to store against the winter, and yet they never seem to go hungry. But try running a farm with that kind of philosophy, and you will find your family eating stones before the Feast of Booths." And yet, Jesus observed, stepping up beside the farmer and watching the frantic scramble of the sparrows in the dust, they leave without the terror that consumes the heart of the man who owns the barn. They trust in a table that is always set, a providence that requires no ledger to balance its accounts. It is easy to trust when you have nothing to lose. A new voice broke into the conversation from ahead. A wayfarer, a man clad in the dusty, travel-stained garments of a Judean merchant, carrying a heavy leather pouch of coins secured tightly beneath his belt, stepped out from the shadow of an olive press where he had been resting against the cool, stone pillar. His face was sharp, lined with the relentless vigilance of someone who spent his life guarding merchandise against highwaymen and dishonest brokers along the turbulent trade routes that connected Damascus to the great ports of the Mediterranean. "I have spent 20 years buying and selling wheat in the markets of Tyre and Caesarea," the wayfarer continued, his tone edged with the defensive cynicism of the marketplace. "I know the exact price of every bushel of grain between here and the Great Sea. I know that if you cast your seed upon a footpath, you are a fool. If you cast it among rocks, you are negligent. If you let the thorns choke your crop, you are ruined. Life does not reward the careless dreamer, master. Life rewards the man who calculates every risk, fences his property with iron, and drives a hard bargain against the uncertainties of tomorrow." Jesus turned to look at the merchant, his expression entirely devoid of anger or condescension, reflecting instead a deep, patient sorrow that seemed to encompass all the heavy burdens the man carried within his leather purse and his armored heart. "You speak of survival, friend," Jesus said softly, taking a slow step toward the merchant. "And indeed, you have survived. Your walls are high, your guards are alert, and your ledgers are impeccably balanced. But tell me, when was the last time you sat down in the evening and felt the quiet, unenjoy of a child falling asleep in its mother's arms? When was the last time your wealth allowed you to forget the weight of your own existence, even for a single hour?" The merchant opened his mouth to reply, a sharp retort already forming on his tongue, but the words caught in his throat. He looked into the eyes of the Nazarene, eyes that seemed to see completely through the heavy layers of silk and wool, past the bulging money pouch, straight down into the dry, vaulted chambers of an inner life that had not tasted the fresh water of genuine vulnerability in decades. The man swallowed hard, his gaze dropping involuntarily to the dusty toes of his expensive leather sandals, while a heavy, palpable silence descended upon the little group. The rustle of the wind through the high olive branches sounded like the whispering of distant waters. Down in the valley, the sun had now cleared the eastern ridge entirely, flooding the broad, fertile expanse of the plain with a brilliant, golden radiance that made the dew-soaked weeds sparkle like scattered diamonds across the floor of the fields. "The seed that fell among the thorns," Jesus resumed, his voice carrying a gentle cadence that seemed to soothe the sudden tension in the air, "is not the life of a wicked man. It is the life of a man caught in the machinery of his own anxieties. He hears the word, the invitation to a deeper freedom, but immediately the worries of this life, the price of grain, the demands of creditors, the fear of tomorrow's poverty, grow up around him like wild briars. They crowd out the light. They choke the breath from the lungs until there is no room left for anything except the frantic struggle to keep up appearances. Jonathan the farmer listened, his weather-beaten hands tightening almost imperceptibly around his empty seed basket. He thought of his own home, of the constant, nagging worry that kept him awake during the long, humid nights of summer, calculating the interest on his loans, wondering if the late rains would fail, watching his eldest son grow bitter under the crushing weight of ancestral debts. The thorns were not foreign invaders from some distant land, they were the very preoccupations he tended every single day with the same diligence he gave to his wheat. And the good ground? Jonathan asked, his voice uncharacteristically small, stripped of all its usual defensive pride. The soil that yields 30, 60, 100-fold? How does a man turn his own heart into that kind of earth, master? I cannot simply command the stones to vanish from my ribs, nor can I order the thorns to stop growing in a soil that has been wild for generations. No, Jesus agreed, placing a warm, steady hand upon the farmer's sturdy shoulder. You cannot do it by an act of sheer will. You cannot force yourself to be open any more than a closed fist can grasp a gift without first uncurling its fingers. The preparation of the soil is the work of patience. It begins the moment you stop running from the silence, the moment you allow the plow of honesty to break open the hard crust of your self-protection, and you simply wait in the dark for the rain to fall. They began to move again, descending the final slope toward the bustling threshing floors at the edge of the village, where a group of local laborers had already begun tossing the harvested grain into the morning air with wooden pitchforks, letting the steady westerly breeze carry away the worthless chaff while the heavy golden kernels fell in a rich, satisfying cascade back onto the woven mats below. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty aroma of winnowed barley. The rhythmic shouts of the workers, the barking of village dogs, and the cheerful laughter of children playing near the irrigation channels blended together into a familiar, earthy symphony of human labor and daily bread. Yet, amidst the clatter of the active marketplace and the bustling movement of the rural community, the small company of travelers moved with an inward stillness, each heart turning over its own hidden furrows, waiting for the wind to shift and the unseen sower to cast his reckless, magnificent grace once more upon the world. The afternoon sun drifted lower toward the jagged western rim of the hills, casting long, indigo shadows across the terraced olive groves that climbed the lower slopes above the lake. Jonathan the tenant farmer wiped the sweat from his sun-browned brow with the back of a calloused hand, leaning for a moment against the rough, grey trunk of an ancient fig tree whose sprawling branches offered a cool, dappled refuge from the glare of the day. Beside him, Simon Peter let out a long, weary sigh, his broad shoulders dropping as he unslung a heavy water skin from his shoulder and offered it first to the farmer with a warm, rumbling gesture of camaraderie. The fisherman and the laborers shared the quiet space beneath the leaves, listening to the distant, rhythmic lapping of the Galilean tide against the pebbled shore far below, where painted wooden skiffs bobbed gently upon the turquoise water like resting waterfowl. The soil of this region has a stubborn memory, Jonathan, Peter murmured, his voice rich and gravelly like stones rolling in a brook, as he wiped droplets of cool water from his beard. You clear the stones away in the spring, hauling them up to build the boundary walls with aching backs and blistered palms, only to return the following year and find a fresh crop of flint waiting in the furrows, as if the earth itself were breeding them in the dark. Jonathan offered a quiet, knowing smile, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked out over the patchwork quilt of fields that sloped downward toward the valley floor. "It is the way of the limestone, Master Peter," Jonathan replied softly, his voice carrying the steady cadence of a man who spent his life conversing with the seasons. "The hills are old, and they hold fast to their bones. You learn after many planting seasons not to fight the ground, but to understand its temperament, where the subsurface rock lies too thin for the roots to travel deep, and where the rich alluvial silt gathers thick and dark in the hollows where the winter rains run true." A few paces away, Miriam of Magdala sat upon a moss-covered boulder, her fingers gently turning a smooth, sun-warmed pebble she had picked up from the path. Her gaze was fixed upon the winding dirt track that meandered northward toward Capernaum, where small clusters of wildflowers, scarlet anemones, and golden mustard blossoms still clung tenaciously to the dusty margins of the road. She thought of the various travelers who walked these ancient trade routes day after day, carrying their heavy burdens of commerce, grief, and unspoken anxiety, their sandals kicking up small, ephemeral clouds of grey dust that settled silently upon the leaves of the roadside weeds. How easily a human heart resembled those well-trodden paths, she reflected inwardly, where the constant passing of hurried feet, endless demands, and superficial distractions packed the soil down until it grew as hard and impenetrable as a threshing floor. When truth fell upon such a surface, it could find no purchase, remaining exposed and vulnerable until the swift, sharp-eyed birds of the air descended without warning to snatch it away before the first fragile root could even dream of moisture. Jesus stood a short distance away near the low stone retaining wall of the terrace, looking out over the vast expanse of the landscape with an expression of profound, tender attentiveness. His woolen cloak, the color of unbleached flax, stirred gently in the gathering evening breeze that began to sweep down from the snowy heights of Mount Hermon far to the north, bringing with it a sudden, refreshing coolness that contrasted sharply with the baked stillness of the afternoon. Old Eli, the village watchman whose eyesight had long since grown dim but whose perception of human character remained remarkably sharp, limped slowly over to join him, leaning heavily upon a polished staff of carved almond wood. "The shadows lengthen quickly in these valleys, teacher," Eli observed quietly, squinting against the golden slanting light that turned the surface of the lake into a sheet of hammered copper. "The day slips through our fingers like dry wheat through an open palm." "And yet, Eli, every shadow is cast by a light," Jesus answered, turning his head with a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "The sower does not scatter his precious seed only upon the manicured garden beds where the work is easy and the soil is sweet. He casts it everywhere, upon the beaten path, upon the shallow shelf of rock, among the thorny briars that choke the margins, because his heart is filled with a reckless, extravagant generosity that refuses to write off any portion of the field as utterly lost." Eli stroked his white beard thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping across the terraced hillsides where the wild thorns grew thick and green in the neglected corners, their tangled branches guarding sharp, hidden barbs. "Those thorns have a fierce vitality of their own," the old man muttered, shaking his head. "You can cut them back to the root with a sickle, burn them with fire until nothing remains but grey ash, and yet by the time the autumn rains return, they are already pushing their green shoots through the earth again, suffocating whatever noble grain dares to rise beside them. They represent the quiet, persistent cares of this world, Jesus said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that seemed to harmonize with the rising evening wind rustling through the olive branches. The deceitful lure of wealth, the gnawing anxiety over tomorrow's bread, the endless anxieties that crowd the chambers of the mind until there is no breathing room left for the word of the kingdom. The seed falls, it germinates, it even begins to show a pale, hopeful blade, but the air is slowly squeezed out of its life by 1,000 competing demands. As the sun dipped further below the western horizon, painting the high cirrus clouds in brilliant shades of amber, violet, and rose, the small company gathered closer together, sensing the natural transition from the labor of the day to the quiet communion of the evening meal. Jonathan motioned for them to follow him down a narrow, stone-paved footpath that wound between ancient stone walls toward his homestead, where a curl of blue wood smoke was already rising lazily from the clay chimney of a low-roofed stone cottage. The air grew sweet with the scent of burning olive wood and baking barley flatbread, mingling with the earthy fragrance of evening dew settling upon the vegetable gardens below. Along the borders of the path, night-blooming flowers were beginning to unfurl their pale petals to the cooling air, while overhead, the first bright stars of the evening pierced the deepening velvet of the twilight sky. Steady and enduring lamps hung in the vast expanse of the cosmos. They sat upon woven rush mats spread across the hard-packed earth of the courtyard, passing a simple earthen bowl of lentil stew seasoned with garlic, cumin, and fresh mint, breaking warm, coarse bread with their hands in the ancient rhythm of hospitality and shared existence. The flickering flame of a small terracotta oil lamp cast dancing shadows against the whitewashed stone walls, illuminating the weather-beaten faces of the men and women who had left their nets, their fields, and their daily routines to follow a voice that spoke of hidden treasures and unseen kingdoms. In the quiet stillness that settled over the courtyard after the meal was finished, Miriam looked across the low wooden table at Jesus, whose face was illuminated by the warm, amber glow of the oil lamp. She marveled at the profound patience etched in the lines around his eyes, a patience that mirrored the unhurried work of the earth itself, which required months of darkness, silence, and unseen transformation before a single golden stalk could burst forth into the light of harvest. The mystery of the kingdom was not locked away behind towering fortress gates or reserved for the brilliant and the powerful. It was scattered freely upon the common dirt of human life, waiting quietly for a heart willing to become deep, receptive soil. The flicker of the oil lamp slowly softened as the wick sputtered in its pool of olive oil, casting long, dancing shadows against the whitewashed stone walls of the courtyard. Outside, the cool night air of Galilee carried the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional soft, contented shifting of sheep resting in the nearby enclosure. Jonathan the tenant farmer sat motionless on a low wooden bench, his calloused hands resting heavily upon his knees, turning over the profound weight of the words that had been spoken in the twilight. He thought of his own fields, the stubborn patches of ground near the old limestone ridge where the sheep grazed, the weed-choked corners where the creeping briars choked out the spring wheat, and the rich, dark loam down by the valley floor that drank deeply of the winter rains. Beside him, Simon Peter leaned back against the sturdy timber post of the portico, rubbing his tired eyes with the back of a weather-beaten hand, feeling the quiet exhaustion of a long day that had begun before dawn on the restless waters of the lake. The fisherman let out a gentle, reflective sigh, wondering how often his own impulsive nature had acted like the hard-packed footpath beside the road, where the constant trampling of hurried thoughts left no room for anything lasting to take root. Across the table, Miriam of Magdala remained seated in stillness, her gaze fixed upon the dying embers of the hearth, letting the silence wrap around her like a woven mantle of peace. She considered the mystery of the sower, one who did not hoard his seed behind locked granaries, but scattered it with an extravagant, almost reckless generosity, trusting the earth to know its own profound calling. The night deepened, wrapping the sleeping village of Capernaum in a velvet blanket of profound quiet, while the stars above traced their ancient, unhurried paths across the vast expanse of the Judean sky. When the first pale streak of silver brushed the eastern horizon, heralding the slow and majestic return of the dawn, the household began to stir with the quiet, purposeful rhythm of a new day. Old Eli, the village baker, was already tending to his stone ovens down the winding dirt lane, the comforting aroma of rising dough and wood smoke drifting lazily through the crisp morning air. Jesus stepped out into the open courtyard, greeting the morning light with a quiet serenity, his gaze lifting toward the rolling hills that sloped upward from the shimmering expanse of the lake. Today the road beckoned them onward, winding away from the sheltering walls of the village and climbing toward the fertile plateaus where the spring wildflowers were just beginning to unfurl their vibrant petals of blue and gold. The journey began in a gentle hush, with sandals crunching softly upon the dew-kissed gravel of the footpath as the small company of travelers set out beneath a canopy of pale amber and violet sky. Jonathan walked alongside Jesus, leading a sturdy pack mule laden with simple provisions, his mind turning over the practical labors of agriculture that filled his days with sweat and sun. "Rabbi," Jonathan spoke softly, breaking the morning quiet as a pair of turtle doves darted gracefully from the branches of a wild olive tree. "How is it that some hearts receive the word like a well-plowed field, while others remain as hard as the stones we pull from the furrow every spring?" Jesus turned his gaze toward the farmer, a gentle warmth touching his features as the morning sun crested the distant ridge, casting a golden brilliance across the dew-soaked landscape. "The heart, Jonathan, is shaped by what it allows to rest upon it," Jesus replied, his voice carrying the calm, steady cadence of a flowing brook. When the path is trodden down day after day by the endless rush of worries, ambitions, and the noise of the world, it grows as hard as stone, leaving no space for the seed to sink beneath the surface. And so the birds of the air come swiftly and snatch it away before the first fragile root can even dream of moisture. They walked on in companionable silence, passing terraced hillsides where generations of farmers had painstakingly stacked grey limestone boulders to create flat benches of earth for planting barley and lentils. The historical labor of the land was etched into every contour of the valley, ancient olive presses carved directly into the living rock, cisterns plastered with lime to catch the precious winter rains, and narrow boundary paths worn smooth by the sandals of countless ancestors. Miriam walked a little ahead, her hand brushing lightly against the tall stalks of wild mustard grass that bordered the path, marveling at how the creation obeyed an invisible, unyielding rhythm of leaf and growth. She thought of the second soil, the shallow layer of earth spread thinly over a shelf of hidden bedrock, and how easily the young green shoots could spring up in the warmth of an early spring day, only to wither when the fierce sirocco wind blew across the desert. And what of those whose joy is sudden and bright, yet brief as the morning dew? Miriam asked softly, turning back to catch the eye of the Nazarene as they paused by a stone well to rest. They welcomed the message with gladness. Jesus answered, leaning against the moss-covered rim of the well, yet they have never permitted the plow of self-examination to break through the hidden bedrock of their fears. When the scorching heat of hardship or persecution arises because of the word, they stumble, for they have no depth of earth to sustain them through the dry and weary seasons. Old Eli, who had joined them for this stretch of the journey, nodded slowly, stroking his white beard as he recalled the countless loaves of bread he had baked throughout his long life, knowing full well that good wheat required both the bitter wind and the crushing millstone before it could become nourishment for the soul. The sun climbed higher into the azure sky, warming the dusty trail and releasing the rich, earthy scent of damp soil, crushed wild mint, and sun-baked rock. They crested the final rise of the hill, and before them lay the broad, sweeping expanse of the Gennesaret plain, a patchwork of green fields, orchards of pomegranates, and vineyards where tender green tendrils were beginning to wrap themselves around sturdy wooden stakes. Here, the struggle of the farmer was laid bare for all to see, the eternal battle between the cultivated crop and the stubborn, persistent thorns that leave in the very fabric of the wilderness. Jonathan pointed toward a neglected patch of land near the edge of an abandoned vineyard, where thickets of briars and prickly boxthorn completely dominated the ground, leaving no sunlight to reach the shadowed earth beneath. "The thorns need no planting," Jonathan murmured with a rueful smile. "They claim the soil without an ounce of labor, choking out anything useful that dares to grow." "Indeed," Jesus said, his eyes reflecting the vast, open horizon. "The cares of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the quiet, creeping desires for everything else enter in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. The soil may be deep, and the moisture may be plentiful, but if the garden is left untended, the weeds of distraction will always crowd out the harvest." Yet, beyond the choked field, another sight met their eyes, a wide expanse of rich, dark alluvial earth, carefully plowed into straight, even furrows that stretched toward the sparkling blue waters of the lake. Here, workers had labored for weeks to turn the heavy clods, pulling out stones and clearing away the roots of wild shrubs, preparing a home for the precious grain that would soon feed the villages along the shore. In this fertile sanctuary, every seed that fell into the welcoming darkness would find nourishment, protection, and room to expand its roots deep into the cooling earth. "Blessed are those who hear the word and hold it fast in an honest and good heart," Jesus whispered, his voice blending harmoniously with the gentle rustle of the breeze through the olive groves. "For they produce a harvest, 30, 60, even 100-fold, bearing fruit with patience and quiet endurance." The travelers lingered by the edge of the great field, bathed in the warm, radiant light of the midday sun, feeling the profound stillness of the landscape settle deeply into their spirits. The mystery of the kingdom was no longer a distant riddle, but a living reality written across the hills and valleys of Galilee, waiting in the quiet earth for anyone willing to stop, to listen, and to let their heart become deep, receptive soil. As the midday heat began to soften into the long, amber shadows of late afternoon, the small company of travelers turned their footsteps away from the bustling agricultural terraces and wound their way downward along a narrow, stone-paved track toward the tranquil shores of the Sea of Galilee. Old Eli walked with a measured, deliberate pace, his weathered wooden staff tapping rhythmically against the sun-baked limestone of the path, while Jonathan the tenant farmer lingered behind for a moment, gently lifting a handful of the rich, dark valley loam to let it sift slowly through his calloused fingers like fine hourglass sand. The air grew progressively cooler as they descended, carrying the subtle, refreshing scent of fresh water, damp river reeds, and the pungent, earthy fragrance of wild mint growing in thick, sprawling clusters near the sluggish runoff streams. Miriam of Magdala walked quietly beside Simon Peter, her gaze fixed upon the shimmering expanse of the lake below, which mirrored the vast, cloudless dome of the sky in shades of bruised cobalt, burnished copper, and pale, luminous gold. The seed has been scattered across every conceivable kind of ground today, Miriam murmured softly, her voice barely rising above the gentle rustle of dry olive leaves shivering in the declining thermal breeze. And yet, the sower did not withhold his hand from the hard footpath, nor did he abandon the rocky shelf where the thorns would eventually crowd the light. Simon Peter wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the edge of his coarse woolen tunic, his broad shoulders relaxing as the cool lake air finally reached them. "It defies all efficient husbandry," the fisherman replied, shaking his head with a faint, affectionate smile as he glanced toward the front of the procession where Jesus walked in contemplative silence. "My brother Andrew and I would never cast good barley or wheat where the sheep tread daily into stone. It feels like such a lavish, unnecessary waste." "Perhaps," old Eli interjected gently, slowing his steps to match theirs as the path widened near a cluster of ancient tamarisk trees, "divine wisdom measures productivity not merely by the immediate yield of a single season, but by the boundless patience of the earth itself. The Creator does not calculate the worth of the soil before offering the word, the offering itself is what transforms the ground." They reached the pebbled shoreline just as the sun dipped low enough to touch the jagged crests of the distant Golan Heights, casting a brilliant, blinding streak of ruby light directly across the glassy surface of the water, where a few wooden fishing skiffs were already pulling in their nets for the evening. The rhythmic lapping of tiny ripples against the smooth basalt stones provided a steady, hypnotic cadence, washing away the lingering dust of the long journey and inviting a deep, restorative stillness into every weary limb. Jesus turned to face his companions as they gathered beneath the low-spreading branches of a gnarled fig tree, his eyes reflecting the warm, dying embers of the sunset with a look of profound, abiding peace. "The kingdom of heaven is like a hidden spring deep within the valley," Jesus said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the gentle murmur of the evening tide. "It makes no sound as it rises through the fissures of the rock, yet it sustains every living thing that leans down to drink. Let those who have ears to hear, let the quietness enter their innermost dwelling." As twilight descended in a velvet cloak of deep indigo and violet, the stars began to awaken one by one across the vast, infinite expanse overhead, standing sentinel over the quiet hills of Galilee while the weary earth rested in absolute trust, cradled within the timeless rhythm of the night. And there we leave it, a story told, a night well spent. Thank you for trusting easy drift sleep with your rest. If these stories bring you comfort, subscribing means we can keep making them for you. Good night. Sleep well.